The woman who collapsed on Jonas Whitlock's doorstep on Christmas Eve, 1887, wore rags that barely kept out the Wyoming cold, but what shamed him most was the impulse to turn her away. She traveled 1,000 miles to answer his letter, carried nothing but dignity in a threadbare carpet bag, and looked at him with eyes that had survived storms he couldn't imagine. His daughter Ella saw a miracle. The town saw disgrace. Jonas saw a choice that would define what kind of man he'd become. Follow this story to the end and comment which city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels. The wind that Christmas Eve didn't howl, it shrieked the kind of Wyoming cold that turned moisture to ice in your lungs and made the world feel like God's own punishment. Jonas Whitlock stood at the window of his cabin watching snow devils dance across the prairie, one hand gripping a mug of coffee gone cold. Hours ago, the other clenched at his side like he could hold back time itself. 2 years. 2 years since Margaret died, giving birth to a son who followed her 3 days later. 2 years of waking to silence heavier than any Wyoming winter. 2 years of watching his daughter Ella fade like morning mist. Her laughter growing thin, her questions about Mama coming less and less often, not because she'd forgotten, but because she'd learned that remembering hurt too much. Papa. Ella's voice drifted from the corner where she sat cross-legged on the floor, her blonde braids coming loose, her too small dress revealing wrists that seemed more fragile each day. Will the lady come tonight for Christmas? Jonas turned from the window, studying his daughter with an ache that never quite dulled. 6 years old and already bearing the weight of a motherless existence. The cabin reflected their grief in every corner, dust gathering on surfaces Margaret would never have tolerated. Dishes stacked unwashed, the rocking chair by the fireplace sitting empty night after night like a ghost waiting for purpose. Don't know, sweetheart. Jonas set down his mug, moved to crouch beside his daughter. She was cutting paper into snowflakes with concentration that broke his heart, the kind of domestic gentleness she'd learned from watching her mother now practiced in a house that had forgotten how to be warm. The trains run slow in winter, might be tomorrow, might be... Will she be pretty? Ella interrupted her scissors, pausing mid-cut. Like Mama was. The question stabbed deeper than she knew. Jonas had written to the matrimonial agency in Philadelphia 4 months ago, not out of hope or desire, but out of raw necessity. The ranch needed a woman's hand. Ella needed a mother. He needed... Well, what he needed didn't matter anymore. Margaret had taken that part of him to the grave. He'd chosen carefully from the letters the agency sent. Dismissed the ones with flowery language about romance and new beginnings. He had no stomach for those lies. Rejected the young girls seeking adventure, knowing the Wyoming frontier killed dreamers faster than winter killed cattle. Finally settled on a woman named Clara Hensley from Pennsylvania. 30 years old, never married, practical experience keeping house for her late father. Her letter had been brief, almost businesslike. I understand this is an arrangement of mutual benefit. I ask only for respectful treatment and honest work. I expect no pretense of affection. Perfect. Cold, practical, honest. A contract, not a courtship. Jonas had sent the money for her passage west along with a letter outlining expectations, care for his daughter. Maintain the household, keep to herself otherwise. He'd been clear that this was not a love match. His heart was buried beside Margaret and the son he'd never held. This was business. She'll be fine, I reckon, Jonas said, finally rising to his feet, his knees cracking in the cold. Now finish your snowflakes. I need to check the horses before... The knock came then, sharp, urgent, rattling the door in its frame. Jonas froze. Nobody traveled on Christmas Eve. The nearest neighbor was 8 miles south, and Tom Henderson wouldn't ride out in this cold unless his barn was burning. The second knock came harder, more desperate, followed by a sound that made Jonas's breath catch a woman's voice barely audible through the wind, calling out words he couldn't distinguish, but recognized as distress. He crossed the cabin in 4 long strides, lifted the bolt, pulled the door open, and stopped. The woman on his doorstep swayed like a tree about to fall. One hand pressed against the doorframe, the other clutching a carpet bag so worn the fabric showed more patches than original cloth. Her dress, if you could call it that, hung in tatters, hem dragging in snow that had soaked through to leave dark stains climbing toward her waist. Her coat was missing buttons held closed with what looked like kitchen twine, and her shoes. God in heaven, her shoes were split at the seams, wrapped with strips of fabric that had long since stopped providing any protection. But it was her face that held Jonas paralyzed, pale as death, lips blue with cold eyes, dark and huge, in a face drawn by exhaustion, and something else, something that looked like dignity maintained at terrible cost. Snow clung to her dark hair, which had come loose from its pins to hang in frozen strands around her shoulders. She looked at Jonas with recognition that hit him like a fist. Mr. Whitlock. Her voice shook, whether from cold or fear or both. He couldn't tell. I'm Clara Hensley. I've come from... She didn't finish. Her knees buckled, her grip on the doorframe slipped, and Jonas lunged forward just as she collapsed, catching her weight against his chest. She was light, too light, the kind of thinness that came from meals skipped too often. Her skin through the threadbare dress felt like ice. Papa! Ella's shriek pierced through Jonas' shock. Is she dead? Papa, is the lady dead? No, no! Jonas struggled to pull Clara fully inside, kicking the door shut against the wind that tried to follow them in. He half carried, half dragged her to the chair nearest the fire, lowering her carefully. Her head lolled back, eyes closed, breathing shallow but steady. The carpetbag slipped from her frozen fingers, landing with a thud that sounded obscenely final in the quiet cabin. Ella, fetch blankets. All of them. Now! Jonas barked the order while his hands moved of their own accord, fumbling with the twine that held Clara's coat closed, peeling away the frozen fabric. Underneath her dress was worse than he'd thought, a faded calico patched so many times it resembled a quilt, thin enough to see the shape of her through it, where firelight touched. No petticoats, no proper undergarments that he could tell. Jesus Christ, she'd crossed half the continent dressed like this. Ella returned, dragging every quilt and blanket from both bedrooms, her small face white with fear. Is she going to die like Mama did? No. Jonas took the blankets, began wrapping them around Clara with hands that shook, from cold, from shock, from something else he refused to name. She's just frozen. She'll be fine once she warms up. Go put water on the stove. We need to get something hot in her. But even as he spoke, doubt crawled through his chest. Clara's breathing remained shallow, her skin that bloodless color that spoke of someone pushed past human endurance. Her hands, where they lay in her lap, were red and raw fingertips swollen with what might be frostbite. Those pathetic excuses for shoes had left her feet in worse condition. He could see through the torn fabric where her toes had bled, leaving dark stains in the snow she'd tracked inside. What happened to you? Jonas whispered, not expecting answer from the unconscious woman, speaking more to the universe itself. What the hell happened? The carpetbag lay where it had fallen, gaping open enough to reveal its contents. One spare dress, in no better condition than the one Clara wore, a small Bible with pages worn soft from reading a tintype photograph in a cracked frame, showing an older man with Clara's same dark eyes, and at the very bottom, wrapped in cloth, a wooden hairbrush missing half its bristles. That was it, everything she owned in the world, and it wouldn't have filled a schoolboy's knapsack. Jonas stared at the pitiful collection while something hot and sharp twisted in his gut. The woman he'd sent money to, $50 for passage and provisions, had arrived with nothing. Either she'd been robbed, or she'd never received the money, or she'd used every penny just to get here and had nothing left. The anger came then, surprising in its intensity. Anger at the agency for sending a woman so poorly prepared. Anger at Clara herself for accepting this arrangement when she clearly had no resources to fall back on. Anger at the world that reduced human beings to this, to choosing between starvation in Pennsylvania or arriving as a beggar bride in Wyoming. But underneath the anger, colder and more uncomfortable, sat something else, the awareness of what he'd almost done. He'd opened that door ready to receive the practical, business-like woman from the letters. Someone competent, self-sufficient, requiring nothing from him but a roof and routine. Instead, he'd found this. A woman who looked like she'd walked through hell to get here, who'd spent her last strength reaching his doorstep, who had nothing and no one and nowhere else to go. And his first impulse, the shameful truth he'd carried to his grave, had been to turn her away. The water's hot, Papa. Ella appeared at his elbow, carrying a cup so carefully the surface barely rippled, her little face scrunched with concentration. Should we try to wake her? Jonas took the cup, weak tea he saw the only thing they had, and knelt beside Clara's chair. Up close he could see details that twisted the knife deeper, the careful mending on her dress, despite its overall ruin, suggesting someone who took pride in her appearance even when circumstances destroyed it. The clean state of her, despite the journey's evident hardship, as though she'd scrubbed herself at whatever last stop she'd made, determined to arrive respectable. The calluses on her hands that spoke of hard work, honest labor, a lifetime of earning her keep. Miss Hensley. He touched her shoulder gently, feeling the bones too prominent beneath the blankets. Clara. Can you hear me? Her eyelids fluttered. For a moment he saw confusion in those dark eyes, fear flashing as she struggled to remember where she was. Then, memory returned and something worse than fear crossed her face. Shame. Raw, burning shame that made her try to sit up straighter, to pull the blankets more tightly around her wretched clothes, to compose herself despite obviously still being on the edge of collapse. Mr. Whitlock. Her voice came out barely above a whisper, rough from cold and exhaustion. I apologize for arriving in such a state. The journey was difficult. She stopped, swallowed hard. I can explain. Don't. Jonas held up one hand, cutting her off. Drink this first, then we'll talk. He held the cup to her lips, and Clara drank with desperate gratitude that hurt to witness her hand shaking too badly to hold it herself. She finished half the cup before pulling back, gasping slightly. Color beginning to creep back into her cheeks in uneven patches. Thank you, she whispered, and those two words carried more dignity than Jonas had heard in his whole life. I wasn't sure I'd make it. The train left me in Cheyenne yesterday morning. I tried to find transportation, but everyone said the storm was too bad, and I had no money left for lodging, so I started walking. Walking. Jonas stared at her. Cheyenne to here is 35 miles. 37, Clara corrected softly, meeting his eyes with something that might have been defiance if she'd had the strength for it. I counted. Got lost twice in the dark. A farmer gave me a ride for the last 8 miles this morning, but he was heading to town for Christmas with his family, not out here to your ranch. He dropped me at the crossroads. I walked the rest. The casual recitation of horror made Jonas's jaw clench. She'd walked through a blizzard alone with no proper clothing covering ground that would challenge a healthy man on a good day. She should be dead. By all rights, by every law of nature and sense, she should be frozen in a ditch somewhere, and instead she'd made it here to this door and was apologizing for the state she'd arrived in. The money I sent, Jonas said, keeping his voice level with effort, for your passage. What happened to it? Something flickered across Clara's face, not evasion exactly, but careful calculation, as though she was weighing how much truth this moment could bear. I received $20, she said finally. The agency kept $30 as their fee, which they claimed was standard. The $20 covered my train ticket to Cheyenne, with $7 remaining. I used that for food during the journey, 11 days on the train, and arrived here with 15 cents in my pocket. Jonas felt the blood drain from his face. He'd sent $50 2 months' earnings from the ranch, assuming Clara would arrive well-provisioned, properly equipped. Instead, those vultures in Philadelphia had taken more than half and sent her west with barely enough to eat. And he'd written that cold, businesslike letter about expectations and arrangements, never imagining he was sending it to a woman who had literally nothing. The agency said you were experienced in housekeeping, he heard himself say, hating the words even as they left his mouth. That you'd kept house for your father. I did. Clara's chin lifted slightly, that flash of pride returning. My father was a school teacher. We lived modestly but respectably. When he died 18 months ago, I discovered he'd borrowed heavily to pay for my mother's medical care before she passed. The debts consumed everything: the house, the furniture, his books. I've been working as a housekeeper since then, but the wages... She stopped, seemed to gather herself. The wages were barely enough to eat. I slept in kitchens and attics. When the family I worked for decided to go west themselves, they let me go. I had no references, no savings, no prospects. The matrimonial agency's advertisement seemed like providence. Providence? Jonas couldn't keep the bitterness from the word. And you came all this way in rags, thinking that I'd take one look and send you back? Clara flinched as though he'd struck her, and Jonas immediately regretted his tone. But she didn't drop her gaze, just held his eyes with a steadiness that made him feel small. I came because I had no other choice, she said quietly. I came because the alternative was starving in Philadelphia, or worse. I came because your letter said you needed someone to care for your home and your daughter, and that I can do whatever my clothes suggest about my circumstances. I didn't choose poverty, Mr. Whitlock. It chose me when my father died and left me nothing but debts and my own 2 hands. I'm not proud of arriving like this, but I'm not ashamed of surviving however I had to in order to get here. The words hung in the cold air between them, honest, raw, unvarnished by any attempt at charm or manipulation. Jonas found himself without response, caught between admiration for her courage and horror at the circumstances that had required it. This was what he'd ordered through the mail, like a piece of equipment, not a woman, but a solution to his problems. Except solutions weren't supposed to arrive half-frozen and bleeding through their shoes, carrying everything they owned in a bag that wouldn't fetch 50 cents at auction. Are you the lady? Ella's small voice broke the tension. She'd crept closer during the conversation, studying Clara with the unfiltered fascination of childhood. Are you the one who's going to stay with us and be my new mama? Jonas opened his mouth to correct her. This was a housekeeper. An arrangement, not a mother, but Clara spoke first, her voice softening in a way that made his chest ache. I don't know yet, sweetheart, Clara said gently, reaching out one raw hand to touch Ella's cheek. That depends on whether your papa decides I'm suitable, even looking like I do right now. But I'd very much like to stay if he'll have me. You have a beautiful home. Beautiful. Jonas glanced around the cabin at the dust and disorder, the cold hearth, the emptiness that had settled into every corner since Margaret died. Beautiful was the last word he'd use for this place. It was functional, necessary, enduring, but not beautiful. Unless you'd been sleeping in other people's kitchens for 18 months, unless you'd walked 37 miles through a blizzard with nothing but hope and desperation, unless you'd arrived with 15 cents and the clothes on your back and were still calling it providence instead of catastrophe. You're frozen half to death, Jonas said gruffly, standing up and stepping back, needing distance from the raw emotion churning in his gut. We'll discuss arrangements tomorrow after you've recovered. Ella helped Miss Hensley to the spare room. There's a bed made up in there. Clara. He stopped using her first name, feeling suddenly too intimate. Miss Hensley, get warm, get rest. We'll figure out the rest in the morning. Clara stood slowly, swaying slightly, but keeping her feet the blankets clutched around her like a ragged cloak. Thank you, Mr. Whitlock, she said formally, as though they were discussing business in a drawing room rather than standing in a frontier cabin while she barely remained conscious. I know this isn't what you expected. I'll work hard to prove my worth. You won't regret. Just rest. Jonas interrupted, unable to hear more. That's all I need from you tonight. He watched as Ella took Clara's hand, small, warm, alive, with childish trust, and led her toward the spare room where Margaret had sewn curtains 5 years ago, where dust had gathered on surfaces no one bothered to clean, where a narrow bed waited for an occupant Jonas had imagined as competent, practical, distant. Not this. Not a woman who'd survived what should have killed her and still maintained dignity. Not someone who looked at his daughter with genuine tenderness despite her own exhaustion. Not a person who called this cold, grief-stricken house beautiful because her standards for home had been destroyed by circumstances beyond her control. The door to the spare room closed softly. Jonas stood alone in the main room, staring at the carpet bag Clara had dropped at the pathetic collection of her worldly possessions visible through its gaping mouth. The tintype photograph caught firelight, Clara and her father both looking at the camera with serious expressions, dressed in clothes that spoke of modest respectability now lost to poverty and death. He should send her back. The rational part of his mind insisted on it. She'd arrived unsuitable, improperly prepared a burden, rather than a help. The town would mock him for taking in a beggar bride. The gossips would have a field day, Jonas Whitlock so desperate he'd accept anything in a skirt, even one made of rags. But where would she go? Back to Philadelphia with no money, no prospects, no hope. Would she even survive the journey? And what did it say about him as a man, as a Christian, as a human being? If he turned away someone who'd sacrificed everything to answer his cold, businesslike summons, Papa. Ella emerged from the spare room, closing the door quietly behind her. Miss Clara's already asleep. She was crying a little bit, but she didn't think I noticed. Papa, her feet are all bloody. Did you see? Jonas had seen. He'd tried not to, but he'd seen. I saw Sweetheart. Are we going to keep her? Ella looked up at him with Margaret's eyes blue as Wyoming sky, seeing more than any child should have to see. Or are you going to send her away like you sent away that lady from town who brought us the pie last month? The accusation stung because it was true. Widow Henderson had made overtures, subtle ones, appropriate ones, and Jonas had shut them down with the kind of coldness that made sure she wouldn't try again. He hadn't wanted companionship, hadn't wanted replacement, hadn't wanted anything but to be left alone in his grief. But grief didn't feed a 6-year-old girl, didn't keep a house warm, didn't stop Ella from fading more each day, growing quieter, smaller, as though trying to take up less space in a home that had forgotten how to hold joy. I don't know yet. Jonas admitted, the honesty feeling like defeat. This isn't what I expected, Ella. I thought we'd get someone who could just step in and manage things without complications. But Miss Clara, he gestured helplessly at the closed door. She's got nothing. If I send her away, I don't know what happens to her. Then we keep her, Ella said with the absolute certainty of childhood, as though the answer was obvious. Mama always said when someone needs help, you help them. Remember? That's what she said. Margaret had said that. She'd lived it too, taking in stray cats, feeding drifters who came to the door, befriending the Mexican family. Everyone else shunned when they'd first arrived in the territory. Jonas had loved that about her, even when it made life complicated, even when it cost them things they couldn't afford. He looked at his daughter, small, hopeful, carrying her mother's heart in a world that tried to beat such softness out of people, and felt something crack inside his chest. The careful walls he'd built around his grief, the cold practicality he'd wrapped himself in, the determination to need nothing and feel nothing. It all fractured just slightly, letting in a sliver of something that felt dangerously like conscience. All right, he heard himself say. We'll keep her, at least for now, at least until she recovers. Then we'll see. Ella's face lit up with a smile so bright it hurt to look at. She threw herself at Jonas, wrapping thin arms around his waist, squeezing with all the strength in her small body. Thank you, Papa. Thank you. It's going to be a good Christmas after all. Mama sent us Miss Clara. I know she did. Jonas held his daughter, feeling her warmth against the cold that had settled into his bones 2 years ago. He wanted to tell her that Mama hadn't sent anyone, that this was just accident, an economics and desperation meeting on a Christmas Eve doorstep. He wanted to explain that keeping Clara didn't mean anything would change, that the house would stay cold and empty, regardless of who occupied its rooms. But he couldn't say any of those things. Not to Ella, not on Christmas Eve, not when his daughter was smiling for the first time in weeks. So instead he kissed the top of her head, breathed in the scent of her hair, soap and wood smoke and childhood innocence, and let her believe in Providence and Mama's interventions and Christmas miracles, even though he knew better. Outside, the wind finally quieted. Snow fell soft and thick, covering the tracks Clara had left from the road to the door, erasing evidence of her desperate journey, making the world look clean and peaceful, as though suffering couldn't exist in something so pristine. Jonas watched through the window, one arm still around his daughter, and tried not to think about the woman sleeping in the spare room. Tried not to imagine her journey alone, freezing, pushing through desperation one step at a time. Tried not to feel the weight of responsibility settling onto shoulders already carrying too much. Tomorrow he'd figure out what to do. Tomorrow he'd decide whether keeping Clara was charity or foolishness or some combination of both. Tomorrow he'd face whatever gossip and judgment came with accepting a wife who'd arrived in rags. But tonight, Christmas Eve, with his daughter finally smiling, he'd let it be enough that someone had survived against terrible odds, that his home held one more living soul, that the empty spaces might be slightly less empty for a while. Even if nothing else changed. Even if he couldn't offer Clara anything but a roof and routine and the same cold distance he'd maintained since Margaret died. It would have to be enough. Because what else did any of them have? Morning arrived with the kind of silence that only comes after heavy snow. absolute crystalline, broken only by the creak of frozen wood settling. Jonas woke in his chair by the dying fire neck, stiff from sleeping upright. The blanket he'd pulled over himself sometime in the night slipped to the floor. Christmas morning. He'd spent it keeping watch over a house that now held a stranger. The spare room door remained closed. No sound came from behind it, and Jonas found himself torn between hoping Clara still slept and fearing she'd gotten worse during the night. Frostbite could turn gangrenous. Exhaustion could give way to fever. He'd seen strong men die from less than what she'd endured. But when he eased the door open just an inch, just enough to check, he found the narrow bed, empty blankets folded with military precision, Clara's carpet bag sitting closed on the chair. The wash basin showed signs of recent use, water still sitting in it, though gone cold. She was up then, somewhere. Jonas found her in the kitchen. She stood at the stove with her back to him, wearing the spare dress from her bag, faded blue calico that had been mended so many times the original fabric pattern disappeared in places, but clean and pressed as well as circumstances allowed. Her dark hair, still damp from washing, hung in a single braid down her back. Her feet were wrapped in strips of cloth torn from what he recognized as the hem of her other dress, the one she'd arrived in. She moved with careful precision, favoring her left foot, slightly stirring something in the pot that sent the smell of coffee, real coffee, not the chicory substitute he'd been drinking, drifting through the cabin. "You're up." The words came out more accusing than Jonas intended. Clara turned, and he saw the effort it cost her to keep steady. Her face still carried that exhausted pallor, dark circles under her eyes, speaking of sleep that hadn't been nearly enough. But she managed a small smile, professional and distant. "Good morning, Mr. Whitlock. I hope you don't mind I found the stores and took the liberty of preparing breakfast. Nothing elaborate, just coffee and Johnny cakes. I wasn't sure what provisions you had available or what your preferences might be, so I kept it simple." She gestured toward the table where plates had been set with a neatness he hadn't seen since Margaret died. "I know we need to discuss terms and expectations, but I thought it might go better over a proper meal." Jonas stared at her, this woman who could barely stand, who should have been in bed for a week, recovering, who'd arrived 12 hours ago, more dead than alive, now serving him coffee with the composure of a society hostess. The disconnect between her circumstances and her dignity made something twist uncomfortably in his chest. "You should be resting," he said gruffly. "Your feet are sore, but serviceable." Clara poured coffee into 2 cups with hands that shook only slightly. "I've wrapped them properly. They'll heal. I'm quite accustomed to working through minor discomforts, Mr. Whitlock. I assure you I'm capable of fulfilling my duties despite yesterday's difficulties." Minor discomforts. She was calling frostbite and near-death minor discomforts. Jonas opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. What would he say? That she'd suffered too much to pretend otherwise. That her pride in the face of catastrophe made him uncomfortable because it forced him to see her as a person rather than a problem to solve. "Sit down," he said instead, "before you fall down. I'll get Ella." His daughter's room held the only warmth in the house, literally, since Jonas had kept a fire burning there all night. Ella slept curled under quilts Margaret had sewn, blonde hair spread across the pillow face, peaceful in a way it rarely was during waking hours. For a moment, Jonas just watched her, his heart doing that painful clench it always did when he saw how much she looked like her mother. Same delicate features, same stubborn chin, same capacity for hope that the world kept trying to beat out of her. "Ella, wake up, sweetheart. It's Christmas." Her eyes opened slowly, blinking against the gray light filtering through the window. Then memory seemed to flood back, and she sat up fast, looking past Jonas toward the door, with an expression caught between hope and fear. "Is Miss Clara still here? Did she leave in the night?" The question revealed more about Ella's expectations than Jonas wanted to examine. His daughter had learned that people left sometimes by choice, sometimes by death, but always leaving emptiness behind. The fact that she assumed Clara might have vanished spoke to wounds Jonas didn't know how to heal. "She's in the kitchen making breakfast," he said, watching relief wash over Ella's face. "Get dressed. And Ella, be polite, but don't get too attached. We're still figuring things out." But Ella was already scrambling out of bed, pulling on her dress with the frantic energy of a child who'd received an unexpected gift. Jonas followed her to the kitchen, arriving in time to see Clara turn from the stove with a smile that transformed her exhausted face into something almost beautiful. "Merry Christmas, Ella," Clara said softly, and the genuine warmth in her voice made Jonas's throat tight. "I hope you like Johnny cakes. My father used to say they were the perfect Christmas breakfast, simple enough not to distract from the day's blessings, substantial enough to fuel whatever adventures might come." Ella climbed into her chair, eyes wide. "We haven't had a proper breakfast on Christmas since Mama died. Papa usually just gives me bread and jam." The observation landed like an accusation, and Jonas felt his jaw tighten. He'd done his best. Keeping a 6-year-old fed and clothed and alive through 2 Wyoming winters while managing a ranch alone, it was more than most men could handle. If breakfast had been simple, if celebrations had fallen by the wayside, if the house had lost its warmth, well, he'd been drowning in grief. Couldn't everyone see that? But Clara just nodded as though Ella had commented on the weather. "Bread and jam is perfectly sensible," she said, setting plates before them with steady hands. "Your papa's been managing everything alone. That's no small feat, but perhaps now we can share the work if he decides I'm suitable to stay, of course." She said it casually, but Jonas caught the slight tension in her shoulders the way she didn't quite meet his eyes. She was nervous. For all her composure, she was terrified he'd send her away. The coffee was perfect, hot, strong, real. The Johnny cakes were light despite being made with his mediocre supplies. Clara had even found the last jar of Margaret's preserves tucked in the back of the pantry and set it on the table. The cherries inside still bright red against the glass. When had he last looked at that jar? When had he last noticed anything beyond the raw mechanics of survival? They ate in silence, broken only by the scrape of forks on plates. Ella kept sneaking glances at Clara, her expression a mixture of fascination and cautious hope. Clara ate with small, precise bites, her manners impeccable, despite obvious hunger that suggested yesterday's 15 cents hadn't bought much food. Jonas found himself watching her hands work roughened with those raw patches from frostbite, but moving with a grace that spoke of breeding and education fallen on hard times. Finally, unable to bear the weight of unspoken questions any longer, Jonas set down his fork and met Clara's eyes directly. "We need to talk about the arrangement," he said bluntly, "about what I expect and what you can actually provide given your circumstances." Clara set down her own fork, folded her hands in her lap, and straightened her spine with visible effort. "Of course. I understand you have concerns. I'd like to address them honestly, if I may." "You arrived with nothing," Jonas said, hating how harsh it sounded, but needing the truth laid bare. "No proper clothes, no supplies, barely alive. The town they're going to have opinions about this, about you, about me taking in a woman who looks like—" He gestured vaguely, unable to finish the sentence without cruelty. "Like a beggar," Clara finished for him, her voice steady despite the color rising in her cheeks. "I understand. I know how this appears, but I'd ask you to consider the whole picture, not just the surface circumstances." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts, and Jonas noticed how still she held herself, the kind of stillness that came from years of absorbing judgment and learning not to flinch. "I was raised in a respectable home," Clara continued quietly. "My father was an educated man, a schoolteacher who believed in books and learning and treating everyone with dignity regardless of their station. My mother came from a good family before she married beneath herself. At least that's what her relatives said. They taught me to read Latin to keep proper accounts to manage a household. I can cook, clean, sew, preserve food, tend a garden, care for livestock, and manage finances. I'm not afraid of hard work. I'm not afraid of isolation. And I'm not afraid of the truth, however uncomfortable." She met Jonas's eyes without wavering. "The truth is that my father died leaving debts I couldn't pay. The truth is that respectable society abandoned me the moment I became inconvenient. The truth is that I've spent 18 months learning exactly how far a woman can fall when she has no family, no money, and no male protection. I've slept in attics and kitchens. I've eaten table scraps. I've worn the same dress for 6 months straight because I couldn't afford another. I've been propositioned by men who assumed poverty meant availability. I've been invisible to people who'd smiled at me when my father was alive." Her voice remained calm, factual, But Jonas heard the steel underneath, the kind that came from surviving what should have broken her. So yes, I arrived in rags. Yes, I look like something a charitable Christian might feel obligated to help. But I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Whitlock. I'm offering a fair exchange, my labor and competence for shelter and security. I'll work harder than anyone you could hire from town. I'll care for your daughter as though she were my own. I'll maintain your home to standards you've probably forgotten were possible. All I ask in return is to be treated with basic human respect and not to be thrown back into the world that already tried to destroy me. The kitchen fell silent except for the pop and hiss of the fire. Ella stared at Clara with something like awe, as though witnessing someone fight a dragon. Jonas felt the weight of her words settle into his chest, not manipulative, not pleading, just honest in a way that made his own defenses seem petty and small. "The town will talk," he said finally, because he couldn't dispute anything she'd said. "They'll assume things, about why I chose you, about what kind of woman agrees to this arrangement. Let them talk." Clara's chin lifted slightly. "I stopped caring what people thought of me when the grocer in Philadelphia refused me credit because I didn't have a man to vouch for my character. When Mrs. Wellington, whose children I'd tutored for free when father was alive, crossed the street to avoid speaking to me. When the church ladies who'd praised my needlework suddenly couldn't see me when I came asking if anyone needed mending done for pay." She leaned forward slightly, and Jonas saw fire kindle in those dark eyes. Not anger exactly, but something fiercer and more focused. "I came here because you offered something real work for shelter security for service. No pretense about romance. No lies about this being anything but a practical arrangement. That honesty is worth more than any amount of respectability to me now. So if the town gossips want to speculate about the ragged woman Jonas Whitlock took in, let them. Their good opinion never put food in my mouth or a roof over my head." Jonas found himself without response. He'd expected pleading, maybe defensiveness, perhaps some attempt to minimize the reality of her circumstances. Instead, she'd laid everything bare with the kind of courage he'd seen in soldiers, not society women. And in doing so, she'd somehow shifted the question from whether she was suitable to whether he was decent enough to honor the arrangement he'd initiated. "Papa," Ella's small voice cut through the tension. "Miss Clara can stay, right? She makes good Johnny cakes, and she's nice, and she doesn't look at me like Mrs. Henderson does, like I'm something broken that needs fixing." The observation landed with uncomfortable accuracy. Widow Henderson and the other town ladies did look at Ella that way, with pity and concern and thinly veiled judgment about Jonas's parenting. Their help always came wrapped in criticism, their kindness tinged with superiority. Clara had offered neither pity nor judgment, just straightforward warmth that treated Ella like a person rather than a problem. "She can stay?" Jonas heard himself say the words coming out before he'd fully decided to speak them. "On a trial basis, 1 month. We'll see how things work, how you manage, whether—" He trailed off, unsure how to finish. Whether she could survive here. Whether the town's hostility would break what poverty hadn't. Whether he could stand having someone in Margaret's space, using Margaret's things, filling the silence his grief had carved into sacred territory. Clara's shoulders dropped slightly, not slumping but releasing tension she'd been holding since the conversation began. "Thank you, Mr. Whitlock. You won't regret this. I promise you won't regret this." But Jonas already regretted it even as he nodded acceptance. Regretted the way Ella's face had lit up with hope too fragile to survive disappointment. Regretted opening his home to complications he'd specifically tried to avoid. Regretted most of all the flicker of something almost like relief in Clara's eyes. Relief that made him feel like a better man than he actually was. "There are conditions," he said gruffly, needing to re-establish distance. "You'll have the spare room. Meals together, but otherwise we keep to ourselves. Ella's education and care fall to you. Household management is your responsibility. I'll handle the ranch and provide supplies. We maintain appropriate boundaries. This is an arrangement, not a marriage. Understood?" "Understood." Clara agreed quickly, though something flickered across her face too fast for Jonas to read. "I'll earn my place here, Mr. Whitlock. You'll see." The rest of Christmas passed in uncomfortable adjustment. Clara moved through the house with quiet efficiency, taking stock of supplies, cleaning spaces Jonas had let deteriorate, organizing shelves in ways that made sense. She moved carefully, obviously still in pain, but refused all suggestions to rest. By evening, the cabin smelled of proper cooking, not just food consumed for fuel, but a meal prepared with care. Chicken with herbs Jonas didn't know they had. Biscuits that rose properly, instead of sitting like lead. Vegetables cooked until tender, rather than either raw or mushy. Ella followed Clara like a duckling, chattering questions that Clara answered with patience Jonas couldn't imagine mustering. Where had Clara learned to cook? From her mother, who'd insisted a woman should be able to feed a family on anything from abundance to scraps. Did Clara like snow? She found it beautiful, but unforgiving, which was true of many beautiful things. Had Clara ever had a doll, once made by her father from corn husks, which she'd treasured more than porcelain? Jonas watched from the periphery, ostensibly mending tack, but mostly observing this stranger integrate herself into their lives. She had a way of filling space without overwhelming it, present but not intrusive, helpful but not obsequious. When Ella asked if Clara would sing, she obliged with a hymn in a voice clear and true, the kind that suggested church choirs and Sunday mornings Jonas hadn't thought about in years. That night, after Ella had gone to bed clutching a paper snowflake Clara had helped her make, Jonas sat by the fire while Clara cleaned up from dinner. He'd offered to help some vestige of the manners Margaret had insisted on, but Clara had declined with polite firmness. "You've worked all day, Mr. Whitlock. Let me do my part." So he sat pretending to read a farming almanac while actually watching Clara move through lamplight, her shadows stretching across walls that had held only his and Ella's for so long. She washed dishes with thorough care, dried them properly, put them away in places she'd somehow intuited were correct. When she finally finished and turned to bid him good night, Jonas found himself speaking before he'd decided to. "You didn't have to do all this. Not today. You could have rested." Clara paused her hand on the doorframe of the spare room. "I know, but idleness feels like theft when you've been given something you desperately needed. Your home, your food, your shelter. These aren't things I take for granted, Mr. Whitlock. Every moment I'm here instead of—" She stopped, seemed to reconsider her words. "I prefer to earn what I'm given. It sits better with me." She disappeared into the spare room before Jonas could respond, leaving him alone with the fire and thoughts that wouldn't settle. He tried to read, but the words blurred. Tried to sleep, but his mind kept circling back to Clara's casual mention of 18 months living in other people's kitchens, eating scraps, being invisible. What did that do to a person? What kind of strength did it require to survive that and still maintain dignity? Still show kindness to a child, still believe in fair exchange rather than begging for mercy? Jonas had thought himself strong, surviving Margaret's death, keeping the ranch running, raising Ella alone. But his strength came from having something to lose. Clara's came from having already lost everything and refusing to surrender the only thing remaining, herself. The realization didn't bring comfort. If anything, it made his careful boundaries feel more necessary and more cruel in equal measure. The next morning brought the first test of their new arrangement, and with it the town's judgment Jonas had predicted. Tom Henderson arrived mid-morning, ostensibly to deliver a Christmas ham his wife had sent over, but really to satisfy curiosity that must have burned through the church congregation like wildfire. Jonas saw him coming from 100 yards out, watched the way Tom's eyes went to the cabin windows, like he was searching for evidence of scandal. "Jonas," Tom dismounted, tied his horse, handed over the ham wrapped in cloth. "Mary Beth wanted you and Ella to have this. Said it's not right you two spending Christmas alone." The implication being, they shouldn't have been alone. Jonas should have accepted one of the many invitations extended to him over the past 2 years. Should have integrated back into town life. Should have let the community help raise his daughter instead of holing up on his ranch like some hermit. "That's kind of her," Jonas said neutrally, taking the ham. "Tell her we appreciate." The cabin door opened and Clara stepped out wrapped in Jonas's spare coat because she had none of her own, carrying a bucket toward the well. She moved carefully, still favoring that left foot, but with purpose and efficiency that suggested competence despite circumstances. Tom Henderson's eyes went wide. "Who's that?" "My housekeeper," Jonas said, the words tasting like ash. "Clara Hensley. She arrived Christmas Eve." "Housekeeper." Tom repeated the word like it was foreign. "That the mail order woman you mentioned months back?" Jonas nodded stiffly. watching Tom's face cycle through expressions, surprise, curiosity, and then something uglier, calculation, assessment, the kind of look men gave when they were judging a woman's worth based on appearance rather than character. She looks... Tom stopped, scratched his jaw. Well, she looks like she's had a rough go of it, that the best the agency could send. The criticism, casual, dismissive, made Jonas's hands clench. She's capable. That's what matters. If you say so. Tom's tone suggested skepticism. Mary Beth will want to call on her. Welcome her proper. Though I'll be honest, Jonas folks in town are going to have questions. Woman shows up looking like that, agreeing to this kind of arrangement. Makes people wonder what her story is. Whether she's reliable, whether she's... He trailed off meaningfully. Whether she's desperate enough to be disreputable, Jonas finished coldly. She's neither. She's a woman who fell on hard times through no fault of her own and is working to rebuild her life honestly. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly. Tom raised his hands in placating gesture. No offense meant, just saying how it'll look. You know how the church ladies are? They'll pick her apart first chance they get. Might want to prepare her for that. Or, he hesitated, or maybe think about whether this is the right fit. There's still Widow Henderson. She's expressed interest. I'm not interested. Jonas cut him off. Clara stays. Tell Mary Beth we'll attend church next Sunday so everyone can satisfy their curiosity at once, instead of making a parade through my property. He said it more harshly than intended, but Tom just shrugged and remounted. Your choice. Just trying to help. Merry Christmas, Jonas. Hope that housekeeper works out better than she looks like she will. Jonas watched him ride away, fury simmering in his gut. The easy cruelty of Tom's assessment. The casual assumption that Clara's poverty reflected moral failing rather than misfortune. The implication that Jonas had somehow lowered himself by accepting her, it all made him want to slam something. Hard. When he turned back to the cabin, Clara stood by the well bucket filled but not moving, her expression carefully neutral. She'd heard. Of course she'd heard. Tom hadn't bothered lowering his voice. Jonas crossed to her, took the bucket from her hands. Don't listen to him. Tom Henderson's a good man, but his thinking stops at property lines. What he doesn't understand, he dismisses. He understands perfectly well, Clara said quietly. I'm an embarrassment to you. A woman who arrived in rags accepting an arrangement respectable women wouldn't need. He's wondering what's wrong with me that I'd agree to this. Whether I'm... She stopped, bit her lip. Whether I'm the kind of woman who trades on desperation rather than virtue. That's not... Jonas started, but Clara shook her head. It's fine. I knew what I was walking into. I knew how it would look. But Mr. Whitlock, I need you to understand something. She met his eyes directly, and Jonas saw steel there again, the kind that had carried her through 37 miles of blizzard. I don't care what they think. I care about earning my place here, about proving to you and your daughter that I'm worth the gamble you took on Christmas Eve. The town can think what it likes. As long as you and Ella know the truth, their opinions are just noise. Jonas wanted to believe her, wanted to think she was strong enough to withstand the subtle and not so subtle hostility that would come. But he'd seen what judgment did to people, how it wore them down, made them question themselves, eventually broke even the strongest. Church on Sunday, he said gruffly. We'll face them together. Might as well get it over with. Clara nodded once, accepting the declaration like a soldier receiving orders, and carried the water inside. Jonas stood in the cold holding a Christmas ham. He didn't want contemplating the mess he'd created by trying to do one decent thing. The week that followed established rhythms that felt almost normal, or would have if Jonas could ignore the undercurrent of tension running through everything. Clara rose before dawn, had coffee ready when he came in from morning chores, fed Ella breakfast, while keeping up gentle conversation that drew his daughter out of her shell bit by bit. She managed the house with efficiency that bordered on magical, finding ways to make their limited supplies stretch further, fixing things Jonas had let break, bringing order to chaos he'd stopped noticing. But the cost showed in small ways. The way she winced when she thought no one was watching her feet, obviously still hurting. The careful way she portioned her own meals, always taking less than Jonas or Ella. The hours after they'd gone to bed, when he could hear her moving quietly in the spare room, mending by lamplight, he guessed working on the pitiful wardrobe she'd arrived with because she had nothing else. Ella bloomed under Clara's attention. The quiet, withdrawn child Jonas had worried about suddenly had questions, stories, laughter. She helped Clara bake bread, learn to set a proper table, practice letters Clara taught her with patience Jonas couldn't muster. When Jonas found them one afternoon working on sums together, Clara using dried beans to demonstrate arithmetic, the domestic scene hit him like a fist. This was what he'd lost when Margaret died. Not just a wife, but the warmth that made a house a home. The gentle teaching, the soft laughter, the sense that life contained more than work and survival. Seeing it again hurt worse than the absence had because it reminded him what normal families looked like. And they weren't a normal family. This was a business arrangement. Clara was an employee. Nothing more. Except Ella didn't see it that way. She'd already started calling Clara Miss Clara, with the kind of affection that suggested attachment Jonas had specifically warned against. She sought Clara's approval, her comfort, her company. And Clara, damn her, gave it freely as though loving Ella cost nothing, required no protection against the inevitable end of this arrangement. "You're encouraging her," Jonas said one evening after Ella had gone to bed. Clara sat by the fire mending one of Ella's dresses, her needle moving with practiced precision. "Getting her attached, that's not wise." Clara's hands stilled. She looked up at him with an expression that might have been sadness or pity, he couldn't tell which. "What would you have me do, Mr. Whitlock?" "Treat her with coldness to protect her from future disappointment. She's 6 years old and starving for affection. I won't withhold kindness to make your life more convenient." "It's not about convenience," Jonas snapped, stung by the accusation. "It's about reality. This is a trial period, 1 month. After that, who knows what happens. If you leave, if this doesn't work out, Ella will be hurt. Again. She's been hurt enough. Then don't let me leave." Clara set down her mending, folded her hands in her lap. "Make this permanent. Give all of us the security we need to actually build something instead of existing in this state of permanent uncertainty. Or is that what you prefer? Keeping everyone at arm's length so you don't have to feel anything." The words struck too close to truth. Jonas wasn't ready to face. "You've been here less than a week. You don't know anything about what I prefer." "I know you loved your wife," Clara said quietly. "I know you're still grieving. I know you think letting anyone else in somehow betrays her memory. But Mr. Whitlock Jonas," the use of his first name felt too intimate, made something in his chest tighten. "Your daughter is growing up in a mausoleum. She's learning that love means loss and connection means pain. Is that what you want for her? Is that what your wife would have wanted?" Jonas stood abruptly, the chair scraping harsh against the floor. "Don't presume to know what Margaret would have wanted. You didn't know her, you don't know us." He left before Clara could respond, escaping to the cold barn where horses didn't judge and work didn't require navigating emotional landmines. But her words followed him into the darkness, burrowing under his skin with uncomfortable accuracy. Was he keeping everyone at arm's length? Yes. Was it because he couldn't bear the thought of losing someone again? Probably. But what was the alternative? Opening himself up to more hurt, more disappointment, more grief. He'd barely survived Margaret's death. Another loss might actually kill him. Better to maintain boundaries. Better to keep things simple, transactional, clear. Clara could care for Ella and manage the house. He'd provide shelter and security. Everyone would know exactly where they stood. No complications, no expectations, no risk. Except the plan was already failing. Because Ella was attached. Because Clara was revealing herself as more than hired help, she was becoming real three-dimensional, someone whose pain and hope and determination made her impossible to categorize as simply the housekeeper. Because Jonas himself was noticing things he shouldn't. The grace of her movements despite exhaustion, the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet strength that had carried her through circumstances that should have destroyed her. When he finally returned to the cabin hours later, Clara had gone to bed. But she'd left the fire banked properly, coffee prepared for morning, and on the table a note in careful handwriting. "I apologize if I spoke out of turn. I know my place here. But I won't apologize for caring about Ella or for hoping this arrangement becomes something stable for all of us." C. Jonas crumpled the note, then smoothed it out again, staring at the words until they blurred. The vulnerability in them, the admission of hope, made him feel like the worst kind of coward. She was asking for so little, just stability, Just the chance to build something instead of constantly bracing for the next catastrophe. And he couldn't even give her that much certainty. Couldn't promise anything beyond the trial month he'd imposed. Couldn't let himself acknowledge that she was becoming necessary, that the house felt different with her. In it, warmer, more alive, like something dormant was finally stirring after a long winter. Sunday arrived with brutal cold and clear skies. Jonas hitched the wagon while Clara prepared Ella, braiding her hair with ribbon. Jonas didn't know they had cleaning her face until it shone, wrapping her in the warmest clothes available. Clara wore her better dress, the one from her carpet bag mended until the patches had patches, and had somehow fashioned Jonas's old coat into something that didn't completely swallow her frame. She looked terrified. "It'll be fine," Jonas said gruffly as they climbed into the wagon, though he believed it about as much as she did. "Just a bunch of busybodies looking for something to gossip about. We'll endure an hour of hymns and handshakes, then come home." But Clara's hands twisted in her lap, and Jonas saw her swallow hard. What if they're cruel to Ella, I mean? Children hear what adults say. "If they're talking about me about us, then we leave," Jonas said firmly. "Anyone treats Ella poorly, we're done." But Clara, he waited until she looked at him. "Hold your head up. You've done nothing wrong, nothing to be ashamed of. You hear me?" She nodded, but Jonas saw doubt in her eyes. Saw the scars left by 18 months of judgment and rejection, the learned expectation of cruelty from people who should have shown kindness. The church sat 2 miles outside town, white clapboard gleaming against snow and gray sky. Wagons and horses clustered around it. Families gathering in their Sunday-best children running, while parents called warnings about muddy hems and torn stockings. Jonas felt Clara tense beside him as faces turned toward them, recognition, curiosity, speculation spreading through the congregation like ripples in water. Tom Henderson's wife, Mary Beth, approached first, all false warmth and assessment. Her eyes cataloging every patch on Clara's dress, every worn spot on her borrowed coat. "Jonas, so good to see you, and this must be the new housekeeper. Clara, was it? Welcome to our little community. We're so glad you've come to help poor Jonas and dear little Ella." The pity in her voice made Jonas's jaw clench, but Clara extended her hand with dignity that would have done Margaret proud. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. It's kind of you to welcome me." "Well, we take care of our own here," Mary Beth said, though her tone suggested Clara didn't quite qualify as our own yet. "Though I must say your arrival was quite the surprise. Jonas mentioned he'd sent for someone, but we didn't realize you'd actually come, especially in such weather. However did you manage the journey?" "With difficulty," Clara said simply. "But I'm here now and grateful for the opportunity to serve this family." Other women circled closer. Widow Henderson with her calculating eyes. Mrs. Patterson with her sharp tongue. Young Mrs. Carmichael, who had the decency to look sympathetic. They peppered Clara with questions disguised as pleasantries. Where was she from? What was her family situation? Had she worked as a housekeeper before? The subtext underneath every query. What kind of woman agrees to this arrangement? What desperation drove you here? "Are you respectable or just desperate?" Clara answered with careful honesty, admitted her father's death, the debts, her time working for other families. But Jonas saw how the women's expressions shifted with each revelation, saw judgment calcify into certainty. She was damaged goods, poor marriage material, the kind of woman respectable families might hire but never fully accept. "Well," Mrs. Patterson said finally, her voice dripping false sympathy, "it's Christian of Jonas to take you in given your circumstances. Though I do hope he's being careful, a man alone with a young woman, even one who's, well, even one in your situation. People do talk." The implication hit like a slap that Jonas might take advantage, that Clara might welcome, or even encourage impropriety, that their arrangement was somehow suspect beyond normal employer-employee relationships. Jonas opened his mouth to respond with something cutting, but Clara spoke first. "Mr. Whitlock has treated me with nothing but respect and propriety," she said firmly, her voice carrying to the growing audience. "He offered me honest work in exchange for honest labor. I'm caring for his home and his daughter with the same dedication I'd give my own family. If that arrangement troubles anyone's sense of morality, perhaps they should examine whether their Christianity extends beyond Sunday services to actual charity and grace. The words rang out clear and uncompromising, and for a moment the churchyard fell silent. Jonas stared at Clara. This woman who'd arrived in rags, who'd endured poverty and loss and near death, now standing straight and speaking truth to women who had everything she'd lost. The courage it required made something crack in his chest. Mrs. Patterson's face flushed red. "Well, I was merely expressing concern." "Concern is offering help," Clara interrupted quietly. "What you're offering is judgment. There's a difference. Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe the service is starting. Come, Ella." She took Ella's hand and walked toward the church entrance, leaving Jonas to follow in her wake. The congregation parted faces, showing varying degrees of shock, admiration, and offense. But Clara didn't look back, just kept moving forward with the kind of dignity that couldn't be bought or taught, only earned through surviving what should have broken her. Inside the church, they sat in the back pew, Jonas's usual spot, far from the front where Margaret used to insist they sit. Ella pressed against Clara's side like a barnacle, clearly sensing the tension, even if she didn't fully understand it. Clara kept one arm around her, protective and warm, her other hand gripping her small Bible so hard her knuckles went white. The service passed in a blur of hymns and sermon. Reverend Mackey droning about Christian charity in ways that felt pointed given Clara's presence. But Jonas barely heard it, too focused on the stiff line of Clara's spine, the way she refused to shrink despite feeling every eye in the congregation on her back. When they finally emerged back into cold sunlight, Jonas expected more confrontation. Instead, he found unexpected allies. Old Mrs. Kowalski, who'd emigrated from Poland 30 years ago and never quite lost her accent, approached with a basket covered in cloth. "For you," she said to Clara, pressing it into her hands. "I remember what it is to be new, to be judged. You hold head up. You do good job, yes." Clara's eyes filled with tears. She blinked back quickly. "Thank you. That's very kind." "Kind is easy," Mrs. Kowalski said. "Brave is hard. You are brave, I see." She patted Clara's cheek with rough gentleness, then shuffled away before Clara could respond. Young Mrs. Carmichael approached next, glancing nervously toward her husband, who waited by their wagon. "I wanted to say, I think what you're doing is admirable. Starting over takes courage. If you ever need, well, if you need a friend, I'm 2 miles north of the Whitlock place. Please call on me." The kindness, small, cautious, but real, seemed to undo Clara more than the judgment had. She thanked Mrs. Carmichael with a voice gone rough, then climbed into the wagon before anyone else could approach. The ride home passed in silence. Ella chattered about the hymns and who'd worn what dress, oblivious to the undercurrents. But Jonas was achingly aware of Clara beside him, could feel her trembling despite her attempts to hide it. When they reached the cabin and Ella ran inside, Jonas caught Clara's arm before she could follow. "You did well," he said gruffly. "Standing up to them like that, Margaret would have—" He stopped, the comparison feeling too intimate, too revealing. "Would have what?" Clara asked softly. "Would have liked you." Jonas finished the admission, costing more than he'd expected. She always said character showed clearest when people had nothing left to hide behind. You've got character, Clara, more than most folks in that church. Clara's breath caught, and when she looked at him, Jonas saw vulnerability beneath her armor, the desperate need to believe his words, to think she'd done something right, instead of making everything worse. "They're going to make this difficult," she said. "For you and Ella. Association with me. It's going to cost you." "Let it cost," Jonas heard himself say, surprising himself with the vehemence. "I'm not sending you away because a bunch of gossips can't see past your circumstances to who you actually are. You stay as long as you're willing. You hear me, as long as you're willing." It wasn't the declaration Clara had asked for, wasn't permanence or promises. But it was more than Jonas had thought himself capable of giving, and from the way Clara's face transformed, he suspected she heard what he couldn't quite say, that she mattered, that she'd earned her place, that he saw her worth, even when the whole town tried to make her invisible. "Thank you," she whispered. "Jonas, thank you." She went inside before he could respond, leaving Jonas standing in the cold Wyoming afternoon, wondering when exactly he'd stopped thinking of her as the housekeeper and started thinking of her as Clara, and whether that shift was going to save them or destroy everything he'd worked so hard to protect. The shift happened so gradually, Jonas almost didn't notice, like winter giving way to spring, imperceptible day by day, until suddenly you looked up and realized the world had changed. Clara became woven into the fabric of their lives in ways that went beyond cooking and cleaning, beyond the practical arrangement he'd insisted was all this could ever be. She hummed while she worked old hymns and folk songs Jonas half-remembered from childhood melodies that filled the cabin's silence with something that felt dangerously close to contentment. She left wildflowers in jars on the table, though God knew where she found them in January. She taught Ella to read with a patience that revealed the teacher her father had been turning letters into stories, numbers into games. The house began to smell like home again. Bread baking, coffee, brewing wood polish, and clean linens instead of dust and despair. But it was the small moments that undid Jonas's carefully maintained distance. Walking in from morning chores to find Clara braiding Ella's hair, their heads bent together in lamplight voices, soft with shared secrets. The way Clara had taken to mending his clothes, without being asked her needle-making precise stitches that held better than anything he could manage. How she'd reorganized the pantry with a logic that made finding things easier, had cleaned Margaret's preserving jars and lined them up ready for when garden season came, as though she assumed she'd still be here to fill them. 3 weeks after her arrival, Jonas found himself watching her more than he should, noticing things that had no business mattering to an employer. The grace in her hands despite their roughness, the intelligence in her eyes when she thought no one was looking, the way she'd gained weight not much but enough that her face had lost that hollow, haunted look, the fact that she smiled now real smiles that transformed her from merely presentable to genuinely beautiful. That last observation troubled him most. He had no business thinking about Claire's beauty. She was his housekeeper. This was an arrangement. Margaret had been dead only 2 years, barely cold in her grave, though his mother would have said. Noticing another woman wanting another woman, feeling his heart stir, when Clara laughed at something Ella said. It felt like betrayal of the worst kind. So Jonas did what he always did when emotions threatened. He retreated into work. Spent longer hours in the barn, the fields, anywhere Clara wasn't. Kept conversation to practical matters, what supplies they needed, how Ella's lessons were progressing, whether the chimney needed cleaning. He felt Clara's confusion, saw hurt flash across her face when he responded to her warmth with coldness, but couldn't seem to stop himself. Better to hurt her feelings than to let himself feel things he had no right feeling. But Ella noticed. Children always noticed. "Papa, why are you being mean to Miss Clara?" she asked one evening after Clara had retired early, claiming tiredness, though Jonas suspected it was to escape his hostile silence at dinner. "I'm not being mean," Jonas said, not looking up from the harness he was mending. "I'm being appropriate. There's a difference. What's appropriate mean? It means keeping proper distance. Clara works for us. She's not family, Ella. You need to remember that." Ella's face crumpled, not crying, but wounded in a way that cut deeper than tears. "But I love her, Papa. She's nice, and she doesn't make me feel sad all the time like this house used to. Don't you like her even a little bit?" The question landed like a physical blow. Jonas set down the harness, pulled Ella into his lap, even though she was getting too big for it, felt her small body curl against his chest the way she used to when she was tiny. "I like her fine," he said roughly. "But sweetheart, liking someone and keeping them aren't the same thing. Clara came here because she needed work. When she saves enough money, when she finds something better, she'll leave. That's how arrangements like this work. I don't want you getting so attached that it breaks your heart when she goes." "But what if she doesn't want to leave?" Ella twisted to look at him, eyes too old for her years. "What if she wants to stay forever and be my mama, and we could be happy again?" Jonas's throat went tight. "Your mama is gone, Ella. No one can replace her." "I'm not trying to replace her, Ella said, and the quiet devastation in her voice shattered something in Jonas's chest. I just want to stop feeling empty all the time. Miss Clara makes me feel less empty. Don't you feel less empty too?" He did. God help him, he did. The house felt warmer with Clara in it. The mornings felt less bleak when he came in to find coffee waiting and genuine warmth in her greeting. The evenings felt less endless when there was conversation beyond his and Ella's stilted exchanges. He felt less empty, less broken, less convinced that the rest of his life would be nothing but grief and endurance, and that terrified him more than any amount of loneliness ever had. "Go to bed, sweetheart," Jonas said, instead of answering, kissing the top of Ella's head. "It's late, and you have lessons tomorrow." Ella went without argument, but Jonas saw disappointment in the slump of her shoulders, heard it in the way she closed her bedroom door just slightly too hard. He sat alone by the dying fire, staring at nothing, and admitted what he'd been avoiding for weeks. He was falling for Clara. Not the arrangement, not the convenience, not even just gratitude for what she'd brought to their lives. Her. The woman who'd arrived in rags but refused to be diminished by circumstances, who treated his daughter with tenderness she had no obligation to show, who worked without complaint, who hummed while mending, who somehow made even their sparse meals feel like abundance through sheer force of care and creativity. The realization brought no relief, only fresh guilt and a kind of panic that made his hands shake. He couldn't love Clara, couldn't let himself want what he saw in those quiet moments when she looked at him, and he caught something in her eyes that looked dangerously like hope. Because if he opened that door, if he let himself feel and want and need, what happened when it all fell apart? When Clara realized she'd tied herself to a broken man who'd failed to save his first wife. When grief and reality and the harsh Wyoming winters wore away whatever tenderness might grow between them. Better to maintain distance, better to keep things simple, transactional, safe. But that night, unable to sleep, Jonas found himself in the small room off the kitchen where Margaret had kept her things, the sewing basket, untouched for 2 years, her books gathering dust, her mother's china wrapped in cloth and stored because Jonas couldn't bear to use it or throw it away. He opened the trunk that held her letters, her journals, the small treasures she'd collected throughout their marriage. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper gone yellow with age, he found what he'd half forgotten. A letter Margaret had written during her final pregnancy, when she'd known something wasn't right, when she'd been preparing for a possibility neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Jonas's hand shook as he unfolded the paper, seeing Margaret's careful script, always so precise, like the schoolteacher's daughter she'd been. The date at the top read 2 weeks before Ella was born, 2 weeks before everything fell apart. "My dearest Jonas," the letter began. "If you're reading this, then I've gone where you cannot follow, and I'm so sorry. Sorry to leave you. Sorry to leave Ella. Sorry that life is sometimes cruel in ways we cannot prevent or understand. But Jonas, I need you to promise me something. Don't let grief become your prison. Don't let my death mean the death of your capacity for joy. Ella needs a father who remembers how to smile, how to hope, how to see beauty in ordinary moments. And you, my darling, stubborn man, you need to remember that loving me doesn't mean you can never love again. When the time comes, and it will come, though you'll resist it with every stubborn bone in your body, when someone enters your life who makes you feel less alone, who brings warmth back to our home, who loves Ella with the kind of tenderness I wish I could still provide. Don't turn her away. Don't let loyalty to my memory become a cage that keeps you from living. Worth is measured by character, not circumstance. You taught me that when you chose to marry a schoolteacher's daughter instead of the banker's daughter, your mother preferred. Remember that lesson, Jonas. Character is what endures when everything else falls away. Look for that in whoever comes after me. Not wealth, not status, not perfection, just honest character and a kind heart. I love you. I will always love you. But more than that, I want you to be happy. Promise me you'll try. Promise me you won't spend the rest of your life in a house that feels like a tomb raising our daughter in shadows when she deserves light. All my love in this life and whatever comes after. Margaret Jonas read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face, in a way he hadn't allowed himself since Margaret's funeral. She'd known. Even in her fear, even facing death, she'd thought about his future, his happiness, his tendency to turn grief into fortress walls. And she'd given him permission, given him instruction to find someone else, to look for character over circumstances, to choose warmth over isolation. Someone exactly like Clara. The realization hit with the force of revelation. Margaret's words could have been describing Clara specifically, a woman whose worth showed in her character despite poverty stripping away every other measure of value. Someone who brought warmth back to their home, who loved Ella with tenderness Margaret could no longer provide, who made Jonas feel less alone even when he fought against it. He sat in that dusty room until dawn holding Margaret's letter and felt something shift in his chest. Not the grief disappearing that would always be there, a scar that never fully healed, but the guilt, the sense that wanting Clara somehow dishonored Margaret's memory, that began to crack, letting in the possibility that maybe, just maybe, loving again wasn't betrayal, but survival. Growth. The kind of resilience Margaret had tried to plant in him with her final words. When Jonas finally emerged exhausted and raw, he found Clara already in the kitchen preparing breakfast. She looked up as he entered, started to greet him, then stopped. Her expression shifted, concern replacing the careful neutrality she'd adopted in response to his coldness. "Jonas, are you all right? You look—" She crossed to him, reached out as though to touch his arm, then stopped herself, remembering the boundaries he'd insisted on. "Has something happened?" "I found a letter." Jonas said, his voice rough from tears and exhaustion. "From Margaret. She wrote it before she died in case things went wrong." Clara's face softened with understanding. "Oh, Jonas, that must have been so hard to read." "It was," he admitted. "But it was also clarifying. She wrote about—" He stopped, unsure how to finish without revealing too much. "She wrote about not letting grief become a prison, about remembering what matters." He met Clara's eyes, directly saw confusion there, and something else. Hope she was trying desperately to hide because he'd taught her it wasn't safe to show. "What matters is character," Jonas continued quietly, forcing the words out, even though they felt like stepping off a cliff. "Not circumstances. Not how someone arrives or what they're wearing or what the town gossips think. Just who they actually are when everything else is stripped away." Clara went very still, and Jonas saw her throat work as she swallowed. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I've been a coward," Jonas said bluntly. "I've been treating you like an arrangement, like a business transaction, because it was easier than admitting you're more than that you've become more than that. And I've been cruel because I was scared of betraying Margaret's memory, scared of losing someone again, scared of feeling anything after working so hard to feel nothing." "Jonas," Clara whispered his name like a prayer, or a question, tears gathering in her eyes. "You asked me once about making this permanent," Jonas said, taking a step closer. "About giving us all security instead of living in uncertainty. I said we needed to wait to see how things worked. But the truth is, I already know how things work with you here. The house feels like a home. Ella's happy for the first time since her mother died. And He stopped, gathered his courage. "I feel less empty. That's what Ella said tonight, that you make her feel less empty. She was right. You make both of us feel less empty." Clara's hands went to her mouth, tears spilling over now, and Jonas saw her trembling not from cold or fear, but from the weight of hope finally allowed to emerge. "I'm not asking you to replace Margaret," Jonas continued, needing her to understand. "I'm not even sure I know how to love someone properly anymore. I'm broken in ways that might never fully heal. But Clara, you've shown up every day with grace and strength and kindness that I don't deserve. You've loved my daughter like she's yours. You've made something beautiful out of nothing over and over again. That's not the work of a housekeeper. That's the work of someone who belongs here, who should stay. If you're willing." "If I'm willing," Clara's voice broke on the words. "Jonas, I've been willing since Christmas Eve, when you chose not to turn me away. I've been willing through every cold morning and every moment you pushed me back, and every Sunday in church facing judgment. I've been willing because this place, this cold, hard, beautiful place, is the first home I've had since my father died. Because Ella has become the daughter I thought I'd never have. Because you—" She stopped, wiped at her tears with shaking hands. "Because somewhere between arriving in rags and now I fell in love with you. With both of you. With this life we've been building, even though you kept insisting it was temporary." The confession hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable and terrifying. Jonas felt something in his chest crack wide open, not breaking, but finally releasing the grief and fear he'd been holding so tightly it had become armor. I don't have much to offer, he said roughly. This ranch barely makes ends meet. The town will always gossip. The work is hard and the winters are harder. I'm not the man I was before Margaret died. I'm colder, more closed off. You deserve better than... Don't, Clara interrupted fiercely, crossing the distance between them to press her fingers against his lips. Don't you dare tell me what I deserve. I deserve honesty and respect and the chance to build something real with someone who sees my worth. You've given me all of that, Jonas. You saw past the rags to who I actually was. You defended me to the town. You gave me a home when I had nothing. That's not nothing. That's everything. Jonas caught her hand, held it against his chest, where his heart hammered with fear and hope in equal measure. I can't promise this will be easy. Can't promise I won't mess this up with my stubbornness and grief. Can't promise... I'm not asking for promises, Clara said softly. I'm asking for a chance, for all of us, to see if this... She gestured between them around the kitchen toward where Ella slept. If this can become something permanent, something real, a family instead of an arrangement. Family. The word resonated in Jonas's chest in the spaces that had felt empty for so long, not replacing what he'd lost, but building something new from the ruins, not betraying Margaret's memory, but honoring her final instruction to choose character and kindness over isolation and grief. There's something I need to do first, Jonas said, still holding Clara's hand. Something I should have done weeks ago. He led her to his bedroom, the one he'd kept locked since Margaret died, unable to bear entering it except to grab clothes and leave. The morning light streaming through the window illuminated dust motes, and memories fell across the dresser where Margaret's brush still sat, the closet where her dresses still hung the bed they'd shared for 8 years. Clara hesitated at the threshold, clearly uncomfortable. Jonas, you don't have to... Yes, I do, he said firmly. He crossed to the dresser, opened the small carved box where he'd placed Margaret's wedding ring after the funeral, unable to look at it, but unable to put it anywhere else. Beside it sat another ring, simpler, smaller, the one Margaret's grandmother had worn passed down through her family, with the instruction that it go to the next woman worthy of your heart. Jonas had forgotten about that ring, forgotten the conversation when Margaret's mother had given it to him, saying that if anything happened to Margaret, if Jonas ever found someone else, this ring should go to her as a blessing from the family rather than a replacement. He picked it up, plain silver with a small stone, that caught the light and turned to Clara. Margaret's grandmother wore this ring for 53 years, Jonas said quietly. When she died, she asked that it be passed on to continue a legacy of strong women who built lives in hard places. Margaret's mother gave it to me before we married, said if I ever needed to offer my heart again, this ring carried the family's blessing. I'd forgotten about it until now. Or maybe I was just avoiding remembering. Clara stared at the ring, then at Jonas, understanding and disbelief warring on her face. Jonas, I can't... That's a family heirloom. It should go to Ella someday, not to... To the woman who will help me raise her, Jonas interrupted. To the one who's already shown Ella what it means to be strong and kind and resilient, to the person who's brought our family back to life. He took Clara's left hand, felt it trembling in his. I'm not asking you to be Margaret. I'm asking you to be Clara yourself, fully, permanently. To stay, not as a housekeeper or an arrangement, but as my wife, Ella's mother. If you're willing to take on a stubborn, broken rancher and all the complications that come with that, I'm willing, Clara whispered, tears streaming freely now. God help me, I'm so willing. But Jonas, are you sure? Really sure? Because if you offer this and then change your mind, if you wake up one day and regret choosing me over grief, I won't, Jonas said with certainty that surprised him. I can't promise perfect. Can't promise I won't have hard days, won't sometimes get lost in memories. But I won't regret choosing life over grief. Won't regret choosing you. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly as though made for her hand. Margaret told me to look for character, not circumstances. To find someone who brought warmth and loved Ella with real tenderness. She described you before I even sent that letter to the agency. Maybe that's providence, like you said on Christmas Eve. Maybe it's just luck. But either way, you're here. You're real. And I'm choosing you, not despite the rags you arrived in, but because of who you proved yourself to be within them. Clara looked at the ring on her finger, then up at Jonas, and the smile that broke across her face was like sunrise after the longest night. She threw her arms around his neck with a laugh that was half sob, and Jonas caught her. Held her close, felt her heart beating against his chest, and let himself really believe that healing was possible. That love could happen twice in one lifetime. That the empty spaces in his heart might fill with something new without erasing what had been there before. "Ella's going to be so happy," Clara said against his shoulder, her voice muffled and thick with emotion. "She's been praying for this, you know. Every night, I hear her through the wall asking God to make you see that we could be a real family." The revelation made Jonas's throat tight, his daughter carrying that hope alone, praying for what he'd been too scared to allow. "Let's go tell her," he said roughly, "before she wakes up on her own." They found Ella still asleep, curled under quilts, with her blonde hair spread across the pillow. Jonas sat on the edge of her bed while Clara knelt beside it, and together they gently woke her. "Ella, sweetheart, wake up. We have something to tell you." Ella's eyes opened slowly, confused by both parents hovering over her. Then she saw their faces, saw Clara's tear-streaked smile, saw the ring glinting on her finger, and understanding blazed across her features. "Really?" she breathed, looking between them with desperate hope. "Really, truly, Miss Clara's going to stay forever. We're going to be a real family." "Really, truly?" Jonas confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. "Clara's agreed to marry me to be your mother officially, if that's all right with you." Ella's answer was to launch herself at Clara with a shriek of joy, wrapping small arms around her neck with enough force to knock them both backward. "Yes, yes, yes, I prayed, and God listened. Mama sent you to us. I knew she did." Clara held Ella close, crying and laughing at the same time, and Jonas watched his daughter's pure, unfiltered happiness with an ache in his chest that was somehow both painful and healing. This was what Margaret had wanted: Ella growing up with joy instead of shadows, with a mother who chose to love her with hope for the future instead of endless grief for the past. "Your mama would be happy," Jonas said quietly, touching Ella's hair. "She wanted this for us, wanted us to find someone who would bring warmth back. Clara does that, for both of us." Ella pulled back from Clara enough to look at Jonas seriously. "So I can call her mama now. Really call her mama, instead of just thinking it." The question made Clara's breath catch, and Jonas saw fresh tears spring to her eyes. He looked at her, letting her answer, knowing this choice needed to be hers. "If you want to," Clara said softly, touching Ella's cheek with infinite gentleness. "I would be honored to be your mama, Ella. I love you as if you were born from my own body. Nothing would make me happier than to hear you call me that." "Mama," Ella said immediately, testing the word, then again with more confidence. "Mama. My mama." She threw herself at Clara again, and Jonas watched them hold each other, watched his daughter finally get the security she'd been craving, watched Clara become exactly what she'd claimed to be on Christmas Eve, someone looking for home, for family, for a place to belong. The rest of that day passed in a kind of joyful chaos Jonas hadn't experienced in years. Ella insisted on telling the chickens, the horses, even the barn cats about Clara becoming her mother. Clara moved through the house with a lightness that made her seem to float, touching surfaces as though reassuring herself this was real. Jonas found himself smiling, actually smiling more in those few hours than he had in 2 years. But as evening approached, reality reasserted itself. There were practicalities to address, plans to make, and one conversation Jonas was dreading. "We need to go to town tomorrow," he said over dinner, a meal that felt celebratory despite being just stew and bread. "Make the engagement official. File paperwork at the courthouse for a quick marriage. And," he hesitated, meeting Clara's eyes, "face the congregation. Let them know this isn't just an arrangement anymore." Clara's expression sobered. "They're not going to be happy. Mrs. Patterson and her circle, they'll say you're being foolish, that I trapped you somehow, that it's unseemly rushing into marriage with a woman who arrived in rags." "Let them say what they want," Jonas said firmly. "You're wearing my ring. You're going to be my wife. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me personally." But the next morning, as they prepared for town, Jonas saw anxiety creeping back into Clara's shoulders. She wore her better dress, still patched, still worn, but clean and pressed. She'd braided her hair with care, put on a brave face for Ella, but Jonas saw her hands shake as she buttoned her coat. "They can't hurt you," he said quietly, catching her hands. "Not anymore. You're not alone now. You're not desperate or vulnerable. You're mine." He stopped, corrected himself. "You're with me. We're together. That makes you stronger, not weaker." Clara nodded, but Jonas saw doubt in her eyes. 18 months of being invisible, being judged, being dismissed, that didn't disappear just because circumstances had changed. The courthouse in town was a simple building, all business and no warmth. The clerk, a pinched man named Morris, who'd never liked Jonas much, looked up as they entered, his expression shifting from professional to skeptical as he took in Clara's appearance. "Help you?" Morris asked, making it sound like helping was the last thing he wanted to do. "Marriage license," Jonas said flatly. "For myself and Clara Hensley, and we'd like to file for the quickest ceremony possible." Morris's eyebrows rose. "That's so. You sure about this Whitlock awful quick, considering she just arrived? Some might say suspicious quick." "Some might mind their own business," Jonas replied coolly. "The license, Morris, today." Morris made a show of shuffling papers, taking his time, clearly hoping Jonas would reconsider or provide explanation. "You know folks are going to talk. Young woman like her arriving in the condition she did now, marrying you within a month. Makes a man wonder what the rush is." The implication was clear and ugly, that Clara might be pregnant, that Jonas was covering some scandal, that their arrangement had been improper from the start. Jonas felt rage surge hot, and immediate felt his hands clench into fists. But before he could respond, Clara stepped forward. "The rush, Mr. Morris," she said with icy precision, "is that we've found in each other something rare and valuable, mutual respect, compatible values, and genuine affection. Unlike some people, we don't require years of courtship to recognize worth when we see it. Now, are you going to process our license, or do we need to speak with your supervisor about discrimination against applicants?" Morris's face went red. "Now see here." "The license?" Clara interrupted, her voice hard as steel. "Unless you'd like me to write a letter to the territorial governor about clerks who impose personal judgments on legal proceedings. I may have arrived in rags, Mr. Morris, but I was raised by an educated man who taught me exactly how the law works. Don't test me." For a moment, Jonas thought Morris might refuse entirely. But something in Clara's expression, the absolute certainty that she would follow through on her threat, made him cave. He yanked out the necessary forms, shoved them across the counter with poor grace. "Fill these out. Ceremony can be Friday if you get the Reverend's approval." They completed the forms in tense silence, Morris witnessing their signatures with barely concealed disgust. When they finally left, Clara was shaking again, but this time from anger rather than fear. "I'm sorry," Jonas said quietly. "That was expected," Clara finished. "I knew it would be like that. She stopped, took a deep breath. "I'm tired of people assuming the worst. Tired of being treated like I'm less than human because I had the audacity to survive hardship. Tired of men like Morris deciding my worth based on my dress instead of my character." "Then we'll prove them wrong," Jonas said firmly. "Together. Starting with facing the Reverend." Reverend Mackey at least had the grace to receive them in his study rather than making them stand in the church. He listened to Jonas's request for a wedding ceremony with an expression that cycled through surprise, concern, and finally resignation. "Jonas, I have to ask, are you certain about this?" The Reverend leaned forward, his hands clasped on his desk. "Clara seems like a fine woman, but this is fast, very fast. Margaret's barely been gone 2 years. The congregation is going to have questions, concerns about whether you're thinking clearly or just reacting to loneliness and convenience." "I'm thinking clearer than I have since Margaret died," Jonas said. "And this isn't about convenience. It's about choosing life over grief, about giving Ella the family she deserves, about honoring what Margaret herself asked of me, to find someone of character and not let circumstances blind me to worth." Reverend Mackey's expression softened slightly. "Margaret was a wise woman, but Jonas, the appearance of this, a mail-order bride who arrived destitute, now marrying you within weeks, it's going to cause talk, possibly scandal. Are you prepared for that?" "Is Clara?" "We're prepared to face whatever comes together," Clara said quietly. "Reverend." I know how this looks. I know what people will assume. But I can stand before God and swear that this marriage is based on mutual respect and genuine feeling, not desperation or impropriety. Jonas has treated me with nothing but honor. He's offering me not just security, but partnership, family, a home where I'm valued for who I am, not pitied for what I lack. If that troubles the congregation's sense of propriety, then perhaps they need to examine whether their judgments align with Christian charity. The Reverend studied Clara for a long moment, and Jonas saw calculation in his eyes, weighing Clara's dignity against the congregation's prejudices, measuring truth against appearance. Friday evening, he said finally, after regular prayer service so those who wish to attend can do so, I'll perform the ceremony. But Jonas, he fixed Jonas with a stern look. Be prepared for some folks to react poorly. Mrs. Patterson's circle has already been vocal about their concerns. This will only fuel those fires. Let them burn, Jonas said. We'll build our life anyway. They left the Reverend's study to find a small crowd had gathered outside. News traveled fast in small towns, and apparently word of their courthouse visit had spread. Mrs. Patterson stood at the front, her expression thunderous with Widow Henderson and several other church ladies flanking her like an army. Jonas Whitlock, Mrs. Patterson called out, her voice carrying across the street. Is it true? Are you really going to marry that woman? After only a month? Have you lost your senses? Jonas felt Clara tense beside him, felt Ella press closer to her side, and something protective and fierce rose in his chest. He stepped forward, putting himself slightly between Clara and the hostile crowd. Her name is Clara, he said clearly. She's going to be my wife and Ella's mother. And yes, Mrs. Patterson, I'm perfectly sane. Probably more sane than I've been in 2 years. But she came here in rags. Widow Henderson interjected, her voice sharp with malice masked as concern. She has nothing. No family, no references, no reputation. What kind of example is this for your daughter? What kind of woman agrees to such an arrangement? The kind who values honesty over pretense, Jonas replied coldly. The kind who works hard and treats people with kindness. The kind who loves my daughter like her own. What kind of women are you judging someone for surviving circumstances beyond her control? We're trying to protect you, Mrs. Patterson insisted. Protect this community from scandal. A proper mourning period hasn't even passed. This looks improper, Jonas. Desperate. And her... She gestured dismissively at Clara. She could be anyone. Could have any kind of past. You're risking your reputation, your daughter's future on a woman you barely know. I know enough, Jonas said flatly. I know she walked 37 miles through a blizzard to get here because she'd given her word. I know she's worked herself to exhaustion, earning her place without complaint. I know she treats Ella with more genuine warmth than most of you have shown in 2 years of your so-called concern. And I know Margaret herself told me to choose character over circumstance. Clara has character, more than this crowd is displaying right now. The mention of Margaret seemed to shock them into momentary silence. Jonas used it to press his advantage. You want to talk about scandal? Let's talk about Christian women ganging up to humiliate someone who's done nothing wrong except be poor. Let's talk about judging people based on their clothes instead of their conduct. Let's talk about whether your concern is really for me and Ella or just for maintaining social hierarchies that let you feel superior. Jonas, Mrs. Patterson started, but he cut her off. We're getting married Friday evening. Anyone who wants to attend and offer genuine support is welcome. Anyone who wants to come to judge and gossip can stay home. Claire and I are building a family, a real family based on respect and affection, with or without this town's approval. He turned to Clara, offered his arm, and walked away from the stunned crowd with his head high. Clara walked beside him with equal dignity, though Jonas felt her trembling. Ella held Clara's other hand, looking between the adults with eyes too young to fully understand, but old enough to sense the tension. They were halfway to the wagon when running footsteps made Jonas turn. Young Mrs. Carmichael hurried toward them, slightly out of breath, her face flushed. Jonas, wait. She stopped, glanced back nervously at the crowd. I just wanted to say, I think what you're doing is brave, both of you, and I'll be at the wedding Friday, to support you, not to gawk. She looked at Clara directly. You're a good woman. I can see it. Don't let them make you feel otherwise. Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Mrs. Carmichael squeezed Clara's hand briefly, then hurried away before the other women could intercept her. It was a small gesture, a single voice against many. But as Jonas helped Clara and Ella into the wagon, he saw how much that one act of kindness had meant how Clara's shoulders straightened slightly, how her breathing steadied. The ride home was quiet. Ella dozed between them, exhausted by emotion and excitement. Jonas kept one arm around his daughter while holding the reins with his other hand, and found Clara's fingers seeking his, intertwining with desperate need for connection. "Are you having second thoughts?" Clara asked, finally, her voice barely audible over the wagon wheels. "After all that, the scandal, the judgment, the way they looked at us," Jonas squeezed her hand. "No. Are you—" "No," Clara said immediately, then more quietly. "But I'm scared. Not of marrying you, of that, I'm certain, but of not being enough. Of you waking up one day and realizing you've tied yourself to damaged goods. Of Ella being hurt because other children hear their mothers talking about the ragged woman her father married. Ella will be fine," Jonas said firmly, "because we'll raise her to value the same things Margaret did. Character, kindness, resilience. As for me, realizing you're not enough." He pulled the wagon to a stop, turned to face Clara fully. "Clara, you're more than enough. You've been more than enough since Christmas Eve. The only person who kept questioning your worth was me, and I was a fool for it. I'm not going to wake up with regrets. I'm going to wake up grateful that you survived that blizzard and chose to stay." Clara leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, and Jonas felt the last of her resistance crumble into trust. They sat there for a long moment, just breathing together, letting the Wyoming wind carry away the town's hostility, and leaving only what mattered, the three of them choosing to be a family, despite everything trying to tear them apart. When they reached home, Ella woke up enough to be carried inside, and Clara tucked her into bed with the kind of tenderness that came naturally now. Jonas stood in the doorway watching his daughter and the woman who'd agreed to be her mother, the picture of what healing could look like when people chose love over fear. That night, with Ella asleep and the fire burning low, Jonas and Clara sat together on the small sofa, close but not improper hands clasped, speaking in voices meant only for each other. "Friday seems far away," Clara said softly. "I keep thinking something will happen between now and then, that you'll change your mind or I'll wake up and this will have been a dream." "It's real," Jonas promised, "and nothing's going to change my mind, but Clara—" He turned to face her more fully. "I need you to understand what you're signing up for. This ranch barely makes ends meet. The work is endless. The winters are brutal. I'm not an easy man. I'm stubborn, sometimes cold-prone to retreating instead of talking. And Ella, she'll test you even though she loves you. Being a mother isn't just the sweet moments. It's hard work and frustration, and sometimes feeling like you're failing." "I know," Clara said simply. "I'm not expecting perfect Jonas. I'm expecting real. Real work, real challenges, real life. I've had enough of pretty surfaces hiding rot underneath. Give me honest struggle with someone who respects me over comfortable pretense any day." Jonas leaned forward, pressed his forehead against hers, breathing in the scent of her soap and bread and something uniquely Clara. "I'll try," he said roughly. "To be the husband you deserve, to honor what you're bringing to this family, to remember that you're not here because you had no choice, but because you're choosing us." "I'm choosing us," Clara confirmed, and in her voice Jonas heard certainty, commitment, the kind of strength that had carried her through circumstances that would have broken lesser people. They sat together until the fire died completely, planning the life they'd build, and for the first time since Margaret's death, Jonas let himself hope that happiness, real lasting happiness, might be possible again. Not despite the grief and hardship, but through it transformed by someone who understood that worth wasn't measured in circumstances but in the courage to keep building even when everything fell apart. Friday arrived with the kind of brittle cold that made breath visible and turned the world into crystalline stillness. Jonas woke before dawn, lay in the darkness, listening to the house settle around him, and let himself acknowledge the fear threading through his anticipation. Today he would marry Clara. Today he would make permanent what had started as a desperate arrangement on Christmas Eve. Today he would stand before God and the congregation and claim a woman who'd arrived in rags as his chosen partner. The last time he'd stood at that altar, Margaret had been beside him, young, hopeful, dressed in her mother's carefully preserved wedding gown. They'd been so certain then, so convinced that love and hard work could conquer anything Wyoming threw at them. He'd been wrong. Love hadn't saved Margaret. Hard work hadn't prevented the complications that stole her life and their sons. But lying there in the pre-dawn darkness, Jonas realized something that shifted his perspective entirely. He wasn't the same man who'd married Margaret, that Jonas had been idealistic, believing suffering could be avoided through preparation and determination. This Jonas knew differently, knew that loss was inevitable, that grief was the price of loving, that security was an illusion people told themselves to sleep at night. And he was choosing Clara anyway. Not because he believed they'd avoid hardship, but because he'd learned that facing hardship alone was worse than risking it together. Because Clara had already proven she could survive what should have destroyed her and maintain her humanity through it. Because if he had to weather more storms, and he would life guaranteed that he wanted her beside him when they came. The realization brought a kind of peace he hadn't expected. This wasn't naive hope. This was clear-eyed choice made with full knowledge of what could go wrong and deciding it was worth the risk anyway. Jonas rose quietly, built up the fire, put coffee on before Clara emerged from the spare room her last morning there. Tomorrow she'd wake in the room he'd shared with Margaret, would claim space he'd kept locked and sacred for 2 years. The thought should have felt like betrayal, but instead brought relief. That room had been a tomb. Maybe Clara could help him transform it back into something meant for living. When Clara appeared, she wore the same dress she'd worn to church, her only decent option, but she'd done something with her hair, pinning it up in a way that made her look older, more formal. Her face carried the exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept, but also a determined set to her jaw that Jonas recognized. She was preparing for battle, not celebration. "Morning," he said quietly, pouring her coffee. "You sleep at all?" "An hour, maybe." Clara accepted the cup with trembling hands. Kept thinking about all the things that could go wrong. What if the Reverend changes his mind? What if the congregation stages some kind of intervention? What if... She stopped, bit her lip. "What if you see me standing there and realize you can't do this?" Jonas set down his own cup, crossed to her, took her face gently in his hands. "I'm not going to change my mind. You hear me? The only thing I regret is waiting so long to admit what I felt, what I've been feeling for weeks but was too scared and stubborn to acknowledge." Clara's eyes searched his face, looking for doubt, finding only certainty. "I'm terrified," she whispered. "Not of marrying you, of everything else, of failing you, of not being the wife and mother you both deserve, of waking up and finding out this was just desperation making us both believe in something that wasn't real." "It's real," Jonas promised, pressing his forehead to hers. "The fear is real too, but that doesn't make the rest less true. We're both terrified. We're both damaged. We're both carrying scars from what life did to us. But Clara..." He pulled back enough to meet her eyes directly. "That's exactly why this works. We're not pretending life is easy or love is simple. We're choosing each other with full knowledge of how hard it's going to be. That's more honest than most marriages start with." Clara nodded, her breath shuddering out in something between a laugh and a sob. Okay, we can do this. We can do this," Jonas agreed and hoped he sounded more confident than he felt. Ella woke with the kind of explosive excitement only children could muster, bouncing into the kitchen, already chattering about the wedding, about Clara becoming her real mama, about how they'd be a proper family now. Her joy was uncomplicated, unmarred by the adult concerns weighing on Jonas and Clara, and her enthusiasm proved infectious. By the time they finished breakfast, some of the tension had eased. Jonas spent the morning working through chores with mechanical efficiency, his mind only half on the tasks. He kept catching himself planning for a future he'd stopped believing in, thinking about which fields to plant in spring, considering improvements to the house. Now that there'd be a woman's perspective on what was needed, imagining Ella growing up with siblings. That last thought stopped him cold in the middle of mucking stalls. Siblings meant intimacy, meant sharing a bed with Clara, knowing her body as well as he'd known Margaret's, creating life together. They hadn't discussed that aspect of marriage, had barely discussed anything beyond the ceremony itself. Jonas had been so focused on convincing Clara to stay on, overcoming his own resistance, that he'd skipped over the physical realities of what marriage meant. The thought brought heat and awkwardness in equal measure. Clara was beautiful. He'd been trying not to notice that too much, but facts were facts. And he was a man who'd gone 2 years without a woman's touch, 2 years of sleeping alone in a bed built for two. The prospect of ending that loneliness carried appeal that felt almost guilty, as though desire itself betrayed Margaret's memory. But Margaret's letter had addressed that too, hadn't it? She'd wanted him to live, not just survive, to find companionship and comfort, not spend the rest of his life in self-imposed isolation. Wanting Clara physically didn't diminish what he'd had with Margaret. It just meant he was still alive, still human, still capable of feeling things beyond grief. Jonas finished the chores and returned to the house to find it transformed. Clara had cleaned with a thoroughness that suggested nervous energy burned off through work. The floor's gleamed surfaces sparkled, even the windows had been scrubbed until they disappeared. Fresh bread cooled on the counter she'd baked, even though they'd be eating in town after the ceremony, unable to sit still with idle hands. She stood at the stove now, heating water for baths, her movements precise but quick. "I thought we should all clean up properly," she said without looking at him. "Ella's already washed. I put her in her Sunday dress. She looks—" Claire's voice caught. "She looks beautiful, like she's been waiting her whole life for this day." "She has been," Jonas said quietly, "even before she knew to wait for it. You've given her something I couldn't, Clara. Hope, purpose, a reason to believe life can be good again." Clara finally turned to face him, and Jonas saw tears streaming down her face, even as she smiled. "She's given me the same things. You both have. I was so lost, Jonas, so certain I'd end my life alone and forgotten, buried in a pauper's grave with no one to remember my name. But now," she gestured around the kitchen at the home she'd helped create. "Now I have a family, a place, a purpose. How did I get so lucky?" "Luck had nothing to do with it," Jonas said firmly. "You earned this. Through every hard choice, every mile walked, every moment you could have given up but didn't. You earned this life, Clara. Don't ever doubt that." She nodded, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. "You should clean up. We need to leave in an hour." Jonas washed quickly, scrubbing away the smell of barn and work, changing into the suit he'd worn to Margaret's funeral, the only formal clothes he owned. When he emerged from his room, he found Ella twirling in the kitchen, her dress spinning around her like a flower blooming. "Papa, don't I look pretty? Mama said I look like a princess." "Mama." The word sent a jolt through Jonas's chest. Ella had tried it out several times over the past few days, testing how it felt. But this was the first time she'd used it so casually, as though Clara had always been her mother. Jonas met Clara's eyes over Ella's head, saw wonder and terror and fierce protectiveness there. "You look perfect," Jonas told his daughter, crouching down to her level. "And Ella, you know, this means Clara is going to be your mother for real, right forever. Not just while it's convenient or easy, but through everything. You understand that?" "I understand," Ella said solemnly. "She's my mama now, like God gave her to us because Mama in heaven asked him to. That's what I think happened." The child's certainty about divine intervention made Jonas's throat tight. Maybe she was right. Maybe Margaret had somehow orchestrated this, sending Clara to their door on Christmas Eve, arranging circumstances so that a desperate woman and a grieving family found each other exactly when they needed to. Or maybe it was just accident and economics and desperation colliding. Either way, the result was the same healing where there'd been wounds, hope replacing despair, life choosing to continue despite everything trying to stop it. Clara emerged from the spare room wearing the dress she'd worn to church, but she'd done something with Margaret's old shawl, the one Jonas had given her weeks ago, transforming it with careful pinning into something that looked almost elegant. She'd put her hair up more formally, and someone, probably Mrs. Carmichael, based on the basket that had appeared that morning, had sent wildflowers preserved from last summer. Clara had woven them into her hair like a crown. She looked nothing like Margaret. Where Margaret had been blonde and soft, Clara was dark and angular. Where Margaret had been gentle sweetness, Clara was steel-wrapped in kindness. But standing there in the lamplight, nervous and beautiful and brave, she was exactly right. Exactly what Jonas needed. what Ella needed, what this family needed to survive and maybe even thrive. "You look beautiful," Jonas said, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "Clara, you look like I'm about to throw up." Clara finished with a shaky laugh. "I know, I feel it too, but beautiful works. I'll take beautiful." The ride to town passed too quickly and too slowly, time behaving strangely as it did before momentous occasions. Ella chattered constantly, filling the silence with observations about snow and horses and what kind of cake she hoped they'd have. Jonas and Clara said little, their hands occasionally brushing as the wagon jolted, each touch feeling weighted with significance. The church came into view as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the white clapboard structure gold and pink. More wagons than Jonas expected crowded around it. More horses tied to posts, more people gathering. His stomach dropped. He'd hoped for a small ceremony, just the Reverend, maybe Mrs. Carmichael, and a few others. This looked like half the congregation had turned out. "Jonas?" Clara whispered, her face going pale. "That's too many people. Why are there so many people?" "Curiosity," Jonas said grimly. "They want to see the scandal for themselves. Want to judge whether we look properly ashamed or inappropriately happy. Should we leave, we could go to the county seat, find a judge." "No." Jonas pulled the wagon to a stop, set the brake with more force than necessary. "We're not running. We're not hiding. We're getting married in front of God and the whole damn town, and anyone who has a problem with it can say so to my face." He climbed down, helped Ella, then reached up for Clara. She hesitated, looking at the crowd gathering near the church entrance, clearly visible through the twilight. Jonas could see Mrs. Patterson's rigid posture, Widow Henderson's disapproving frown, Tom Henderson looking uncomfortable beside his wife. But he also saw Mrs. Carmichael waving encouragement, old Mrs. Kowalski nodding approval, and several younger families whose faces showed more curiosity than condemnation. "Clara." Jonas kept his hand extended. "Trust me, please." She took his hand, let him help her down, and together they walked toward the church with Ella between them. The crowd parted, conversations dying to whispers, all eyes tracking their progress. Jonas kept his spine straight, his expression neutral, refusing to show either defiance or apology. Beside him, Clara did the same. Head high, shoulders back, moving with a dignity that transcended her worn dress and modest circumstances. They'd almost reached the entrance when Mrs. Patterson stepped directly into their path. "Jonas, I must speak with you before you do this, she said, her voice carrying to the crowd. "Privately, it's important." "Anything you need to say can be said right here," Jonas replied coolly. "We're not hiding anything." Mrs. Patterson's lips thinned. "Very well, Jonas, this is a mistake. You're acting out of loneliness and convenience, not sound judgment. This woman," she gestured at Clara with barely concealed disdain, "arrived here in rags. She has no family, no references, no position. You know nothing about her past, her character, her real reasons for agreeing to this arrangement. I'm begging you, as someone who cared for Margaret, to reconsider, to think about what this marriage says about you, about your respect for your late wife's memory, about the example you're setting for your daughter." The words landed like slaps, each one designed to wound to shame, to force Jonas to question his choice. Around them, the crowd shifted, some nodding agreement, others looking uncomfortable. Jonas felt Clara trembling beside him, felt her start to pull away as though making herself smaller could somehow deflect the attack. He didn't let her retreat. Instead, he wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her firmly against his side, and faced Mrs. Patterson with cold fury. "You want to talk about character," Jonas said, his voice cutting through the evening air. "Let's talk about character." Clara Hensley walked 37 miles through a blizzard to honor a commitment she'd made. She's worked herself to exhaustion, earning her place in my home without complaint or expectation of anything beyond fair treatment. She's shown my daughter more genuine love in 4 weeks than you've shown in 2 years of your supposed concern. She's been nothing but honest about her circumstances, never pretending to be something she's not, never hiding behind pretense or social position. He paused, letting his words sink in, watching Mrs. Patterson's face flush with anger and embarrassment. "As for respect for Margaret's memory," Jonas continued, "I'm honoring exactly what Margaret asked of me before she died. She told me to look for character, not circumstance, to find someone who would bring warmth back to our home, and love Ella with genuine tenderness. She told me not to let grief become a prison, or loyalty to her memory become an excuse for denying myself and our daughter a chance at happiness. Clara is everything Margaret hoped I'd find. You, Mrs. Patterson, are exactly the kind of judgmental, cruel person Margaret couldn't stand. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Jonas didn't care. He was done with politeness, done with tolerating judgment disguised as concern. Clara came here with nothing but dignity and determination. He said, his voice gentling as he looked down at the woman beside him. She's given me back something I thought I'd lost forever, the ability to hope, to feel, to believe life can be good. She's given Ella a mother who chooses to love her, not one who feels obligated by blood. And she's asked nothing in return except to be treated with basic human decency. If that offends your sense of propriety, Mrs. Patterson, then I suggest you examine what your propriety is actually protecting, because from where I'm standing, it looks a lot like cruelty dressed up as righteousness. The silence that followed felt absolute. Mrs. Patterson stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Widow Henderson had gone pale. Even Tom Henderson looked stunned. Then from the back of the crowd, old Mrs. Kowalski started clapping slow, deliberate applause that seemed to echo in the stillness. Mrs. Carmichael joined her, then several others, until roughly half the gathered congregation was applauding while the other half looked on in shocked disapproval. "Well said, Jonas," Mrs. Kowalski called out. "Margaret was good woman. She would like this, Clara, I think, would approve." Reverend Mackey appeared in the church doorway, surveying the scene with an expression Jonas couldn't quite read. "I believe we have a wedding to conduct," he said firmly. "Those who wish to witness it are welcome. Those who don't may leave with my blessing. But I won't have my church steps turned into a battleground. We're here to celebrate a sacrament, not to judge whether it meets everyone's arbitrary standards." The Reverend's support seemed to settle something. The crowd began filtering inside, some still muttering disapproval, but unwilling to leave and miss the spectacle, others genuinely smiling as they passed. Mrs. Patterson held her ground for another moment, then turned on her heel and stalked away. Widow Henderson following, Jonas felt a small petty satisfaction watching them retreat. "That was—" Clara started, then stopped, seemed unable to find words. "Jonas, you didn't have to—" "Yes, I did," Jonas interrupted. "I should have said all that weeks ago. Should have defended you to the whole town the moment they started whispering. I'm sorry it took this long." Clara's eyes filled with tears again, but she was smiling. "You really meant all that? About what I've given you and Ella? About me being what Margaret hoped you'd find?" Every word Jonas confirmed. "Now come on, let's get married before I have to fight anyone else." The church interior felt warm after the outside cold candles and lamps casting golden light that softened the plain wooden pews and simple altar. People filed in with varying degrees of enthusiasm, some claiming front-row seats like they were watching theater, others hanging back as though wanting deniability later. Jonas led Clara down the aisle, felt her hand gripping his arm so tightly it would probably leave marks, but he didn't care. Reverend Mackey stood at the altar, his Bible open, his expression solemn but not unfriendly. Ella bounced beside them, too excited to stand still, drawing soft laughter from the more sympathetic attendees. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began, and Jonas felt the full weight of the moment settle over him. This was real. This was happening. In a few minutes, Clara would be his wife, Ella would have a mother, and the strange arrangement that began on Christmas Eve would transform into something permanent and sacred. The ceremony proceeded with traditional words that felt anything but traditional, given their circumstances. When Reverend Mackey asked if anyone objected to the union, Jonas tensed, half expecting Mrs. Patterson to have returned just to cause trouble, but silence held tense, waiting, but unbroken. "Jonas Whitlock, do you take this woman, Clara Hensley, to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish? Till death do you part?" Jonas looked at Clara, at her fearful hope, her trembling courage, her absolute determination to see this through, despite everything trying to stop them. "I do," he said clearly, the words resonating through the church with finality. Clara Hensley, do you take this man Jonas Whitlock to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do you part? Clara's voice shook but didn't falter. I do. The rings... Jonas pulled out the simple band he'd purchased that morning, plain gold, because fancy wasn't his style, and Clara deserved something that would last rather than something showy. He slipped it onto her finger beside his grandmother's ring, watching how the two bands caught lamplight. Clara produced a ring he hadn't expected. Where had she gotten it? It was simple iron, probably made by the blacksmith, but she'd clearly spent what little money she had to give him something. The gesture made his throat tight as she slid it onto his finger with shaking hands. Then by the power vested in me by God and the territory of Wyoming, I pronounce you husband and wife. Jonas, you may kiss your bride. Jonas had been dreading and anticipating this moment in equal measure. The first kiss witnessed by dozens of eyes carrying the weight of commitment and consummation and everything that came after. He cupped Clara's face gently, gave her time to pull away if she wanted, then pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was chaste, appropriate for church, but Jonas felt electricity in it, connection, promise, the beginning of intimacy that would deepen with time. Clara's lips were soft, her breath catching, and when he pulled back he saw wonder in her eyes that matched what he felt in his chest. Applause erupted, genuine this time, from the people who'd come to support rather than judge. Ella shrieked with joy and threw herself at both of them, nearly knocking Clara over. Jonas caught them both, held his new family close, and let himself feel the full weight of what he'd just done. He was married again, to a woman who'd arrived in rags but proved herself worth more than gold, to someone who'd survived what should have destroyed her and still had kindness left to give, to Clara, who'd become necessary to his existence in ways he was only beginning to understand. The receiving line afterward proved exhausting. Well-wishers approached with varying degrees of sincerity. Some genuinely happy, others clearly present just to get close enough for gossip fodder. Mrs. Carmichael hugged Clara warmly, whispering something that made Clara's eyes fill with tears again. Old Mrs. Kowalski pressed a wrapped package into Clara's hands with instructions not to open it until they got home. Several younger couples approached with shy congratulations, clearly sympathetic to starting over and building from nothing. Tom Henderson appeared looking deeply uncomfortable, his wife noticeably absent. Jonas, I hope you'll accept my apologies for some things I said earlier. About Clara. I was wrong to judge based on appearances. Mary Beth won't be apologizing, but I am. You've got a good woman there. I can see that now. Jonas accepted the apology with a stiff nod, not quite ready to forgive, but appreciating the gesture. Beside him, Clara handled each interaction with grace that belied her exhaustion, thanking people for their support, brushing off the few pointed remarks with dignity. Finally, blessedly, they were released. Jonas helped his new wife into the wagon, his wife that was going to take getting used to, settled Ella between them, and started the journey home under a sky full of stars. We did it, Clara said softly, almost wonderingly. We actually did it. I'm married. I have a family. This is real. It's real, Jonas confirmed, reaching over Ella to take Clara's hand. You're Mrs. Whitlock now. For better or worse, you're stuck with us. Stuck with you is exactly where I want to be, Clara replied, and the simple honesty in her voice made Jonas's chest ache. They rode in comfortable silence, Ella eventually falling asleep against Clara's side. When they reached the ranch, Jonas carried his daughter inside while Clara followed both of them, moving quietly to preserve the moment's peace. Jonas tucked Ella into bed while Clara stood in the doorway, watching her expression tender. She's so beautiful, Clara whispered. I still can't believe she's mine, that I get to be her mother. She's lucky to have you, Jonas said, straightening from the bed. We both are. They stood there for a moment, watching Ella sleep, the domesticity of the scene hitting Jonas with unexpected force. This was his life now, a wife and daughter. A family, people depending on him and allowing him to depend on them in return. The responsibility felt heavy, but not crushing, shared burden instead of solitary struggle. Back in the main room, awkwardness descended. Clara moved to the kitchen, clearly intending to busy herself with cleanup, but Jonas caught her hand. Clara, wait. We need to talk. About tonight. About expectations. Clara's face flushed, but she met his eyes directly. I understand what marriage means, Jonas. I'm not expecting... I won't pressure you for anything you're not ready for. I know you still grieve Margaret. I know this marriage is complicated. We can take things slow, figure out the physical aspects as we go. There's no rush. That's not what I'm saying, Jonas interrupted gently. I'm asking what you want, what you expect. Because Clara, I'm attracted to you. Have been for weeks even when I was fighting it. And we're married now. We have every right to be together in that way. But I don't want to assume. Don't want to push for something you're not comfortable with. Clara's flush deepened, but she didn't look away. I want to be a real wife to you, Jonas. In every way. I'm nervous. I don't have experience in this area. But I trust you. And I want us to build a real marriage, not just a convenient arrangement. So if you're asking whether I'm willing... She took a shaky breath. Yes, I'm willing. More than willing. The admission hung between them, charged with possibility and vulnerability. Jonas stepped closer, reached up to remove the pins from Clara's hair, watching it tumble down around her shoulders in dark waves. You're beautiful, he said roughly. I don't tell you that enough. But you are. Not just surface beauty, though you have that too, but the kind that goes deeper, strength and kindness and courage all wrapped up together. Clara's breath hitched. I was so scared you'd regret this, that you'd look at me and wish I was her. I don't wish you were Margaret, Jonas said firmly. I loved Margaret. I'll always love her. But Clara, you're not a replacement or a consolation prize. You're yourself valuable, worthy, desired for exactly who you are. I'm not settling. I'm choosing. There's a difference. He kissed her, then not the chaste kiss from the church, but something deeper, more honest. Clara responded tentatively at first, then, with growing confidence, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders. Jonas felt desire kindle, felt 2 years of loneliness and isolation cracking under the warmth of connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jonas rested his forehead against Clara's. The bedroom, Margaret's things are still there. I can move them if you need me to. If it would make you uncomfortable... No, Clara said softly. Leave them for now. We'll figure out together what stays and what needs to be put away with love and respect. But Jonas... She cupped his face with both hands. I'm not threatened by your memories of her. She made you who you are. She gave you Ella. She loved you enough to want you happy even after she was gone. I honor that. I'm grateful for it. So don't hide her away on my account. The generosity of the statement, the mature understanding it revealed, made Jonas fall a little more in love with this woman who'd stumbled into his life at the darkest moment. He took her hand, led her to the bedroom he'd avoided for so long, and together they crossed the threshold into a future neither of them had imagined possible. Later, much later, Jonas lay awake with Clara asleep against his shoulder, her breathing deep and even, her hair spread across his chest. Through the window he could see stars wheeling overhead, the same stars that had watched Margaret die, and watched him nearly die from grief afterward. But tonight they witnessed something different, not replacement, but restoration. Not forgetting, but moving forward. Margaret's letter sat in the drawer of the bedside table, and Jonas thought about her words. Worth is measured by character, not circumstance. She'd known. Somehow she'd known exactly what he would need to hear when the time came. Clara stirred against him, murmured something unintelligible, then settled again. Jonas tightened his arm around her, let himself feel the full weight of what they'd built from almost nothing. Not just a marriage, but a genuine partnership. A family choosing each other despite every obstacle, every judgment, every reason it shouldn't work. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The town wouldn't suddenly forget their disapproval. Winter would still be harsh. The ranch would still barely make ends meet. But tonight Jonas let himself rest in the knowledge that whatever came, they'd face it together. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth more than any amount of security or certainty or social approval. He'd chosen Clara not despite her arriving in rags, but because the woman inside those rags had proven herself extraordinary. She'd chosen him not because he was perfect, but because he'd been honest about his brokenness and willing to try anyway. That felt like the kind of foundation real marriages were built on. Not fantasy or pretense, but clear-eyed acceptance of each other's damage and determination to build something beautiful anyway. Outside snow began to fall again, soft and silent, covering the world in white. Jonas watched it through the window until his eyes grew heavy, and for the first time since Margaret died, he fell asleep without grief being the last thing on his mind. Instead, he thought of Clara's courage, Ella's joy, the future they'd build together in this unforgiving, beautiful place. And he was grateful, so desperately grateful, that on Christmas Eve, when a woman in rags had collapsed on his doorstep, he'd found the decency to open the door instead of closing it. That single choice had changed everything. Morning broke cold and clear light streaming through the bedroom window to paint everything gold. Jonas woke slowly, awareness returning in layers, the warmth of another body beside him, the unfamiliar weight of an arm draped across his chest, the scent of Clara's hair on the pillow they now shared. For a disorienting moment, he thought he was dreaming, that he'd wake to find himself alone as he had been for 2 years. Then Clara stirred her eyes, opening to meet his, and reality settled with a certainty that made his breath catch. She was real. The marriage was real. The tentative intimacy they'd built last night, awkward and tender, and healing in ways Jonas hadn't expected, was real. "Morning," Clara whispered, a shy smile playing at her lips. "I thought maybe I'd dreamed it, that I'd wake up back in the spare room and find out yesterday never happened." "It happened," Jonas confirmed, touching her face with wonder that felt almost foolish. "You're my wife, actually legally my wife, Mrs. Clara Whitlock." "Clara Whitlock," she repeated, testing how the name sounded. "I like it. It sounds solid, permanent, like something that can't be taken away." They lay there as dawn brightened into full morning, neither wanting to break the spell until a small voice from the other room shattered the peace. "Mama, Papa, are you awake? It's morning. We're a real family now." Ella's excitement carried through the walls with enough force to make them both laugh. Clara sat up, suddenly self-conscious about her state of undress, reaching for the nightgown she'd discarded hours ago. Jonas caught her hand, stopping her. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't be ashamed. There's nothing wrong with what happened between us. We're married. This is what married people do." "I know," Clara said, but her cheeks flushed pink. "It's just Ella. She'll know. Children always know. And I don't want her to think—" "She'll think her parents love each other," Jonas interrupted gently. "That's all she needs to think. That's all she'll understand at her age. Clara, you're allowed to be happy. To be a woman as well as a mother. Don't hide that." Clara nodded, but Jonas saw her struggling with years of shame and poverty that had taught her to make herself small, invisible, undeserving of pleasure or joy. That would take time to undo, more time than one night, no matter how significant that night had been. They dressed quickly and emerged to find Ella already in the kitchen, standing on a chair, attempting to make coffee with more enthusiasm than skill. Clara rushed forward to help before disaster struck, and Jonas watched them work together with an ache in his chest that was part grief, part gratitude. This is what family looked like, what home felt like, what he'd thought he'd lost forever. Breakfast became a celebration despite being just the usual porridge and bread. Ella chattered constantly about the wedding, about Clara being her real mama now, about how they should celebrate being a family. Her joy was uncomplicated, infectious, making even practical morning tasks feel special. "Can we do something today?" Ella asked, bouncing in her chair. "Something families do together. Please." Jonas started to refuse. There were chores. Work that couldn't wait, a ranch that demanded constant attention. But Clara caught his eye, something pleading in her expression, and he found himself reconsidering. "What did you have in mind, sweetheart?" "A walk," Ella said immediately. "All together, like we're a real family on an adventure, and maybe we could look for the crocuses." "The crocuses?" Jonas repeated, confused. "The ones the first mama planted," Ella clarified with the careful precision children used when navigating complicated emotions. "You said they'd bloom when spring came. Can we check if they're starting yet?" Jonas's throat went tight. He'd forgotten about those crocuses. Margaret had planted them their first spring in the house, said they'd be the first sign that winter was ending, that hope was returning. They'd bloomed faithfully every year until she died, and then strangely had stopped. No matter how long Jonas waited each spring, they simply never appeared again. He'd eventually assumed they'd frozen or died another casualty of grief, making the world less beautiful. "I don't think," he started, but Clara interrupted. "I think that's a lovely idea," she said firmly, meeting Jonas's eyes with something that looked like determination. "A walk together, as a family, to check on the crocuses and see what else might be waking up now that we're heading towards spring." There was meaning in her words beyond what she said aloud, something about new beginnings, about checking whether dead things might yet live, about the three of them deliberately choosing to move forward together. Jonas found himself nodding before he'd consciously decided to agree. "All right, after morning chores, we'll take a walk." The next hours passed in familiar routine made strange by awareness of everything that had changed. Jonas worked through chores with Clara beside him. Now her presence in the barn, the chicken coop, the morning tasks, transforming work into partnership. She moved with increasing confidence, learning the rhythms of the ranch, asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. "I want to learn everything," she explained when Jonas tried to wave her back to the house. "Want to know how all of this works so I can help properly. I'm not just a housekeeper anymore, Jonas. I'm your wife, your partner. That means sharing the burden, not just cooking and cleaning while you do all the real work." The determination in her voice made Jonas's chest warm. This was what Margaret had wanted too, to be a true partner involved in all aspects of the ranch. But Margaret had been pregnant so quickly, and then caring for Ella, and then pregnant again. They'd never quite achieved the equal partnership she'd envisioned. Maybe with Clara they could. By mid-morning, they were ready, bundled against the cold that was finally starting to ease as February gave way to early March. Ella danced ahead of them, her excitement making her seem to float over the snow. Jonas and Clara followed hand in hand, and the simple gesture felt revolutionary. He'd walked this land hundreds of times, but walking it with Clara beside him, their fingers intertwined, Ella's laughter carrying on the wind, it felt like discovering it for the first time. "There," Ella called, pointing toward the small garden plot on the south side of the house where sun hit strongest. "That's where the crocuses should be, right, Papa?" Jonas nodded, his chest tightening as they approached. The ground was still mostly frozen snow, lingering in patches where shadow kept it from melting. Nothing grew here. Nothing had grown here in 2 years. Whatever hope Margaret had planted seemed to have died with her. "I don't think," Jonas started, but stopped. Because there, breaking through the last of the snow in defiant purple and gold, were crocuses. Not many, just a small cluster, their petals barely open, still shaking off winter's grip, but alive, blooming, rising from ground that should have been too cold, too hard, too dead to support life. Jonas stood frozen, staring at those impossible flowers, feeling something crack in his chest that had been frozen since Margaret's funeral. These flowers. Margaret's flowers blooming now, after 2 years of absence, as though they'd been waiting, as though they'd known somehow that the house needed to heal before beauty could return. "They're here," Ella breathed, dropping to her knees beside the flowers with reverent care. "They came back. Mama, the first mama, sent them back. I know she did." Clara knelt beside Ella, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch one delicate purple petal. "They're beautiful," she whispered. "They must have been waiting, under the cold and dark all this time, just waiting for the right moment to rise again." The metaphor wasn't subtle, but it hit Jonas with the force of truth anyway. The crocuses had waited through 2 years of grief and winter, surviving beneath the surface, where no one could see, holding on until conditions changed enough for them to bloom. Just like his capacity for hope had waited dormant but not dead through 24 months of determined isolation. And Clara had been like that too, surviving underground in other people's kitchens and attics, staying alive through circumstances that should have destroyed her, waiting for the moment when she could finally break through and bloom. "Your first mama," Clara said softly to Ella, "must have been a very wise woman. To know that these would keep growing even when everything else seemed dead. To trust that they'd come back when the time was right." She was wise. Jonas agreed, his voice rough. She knew things I didn't, saw possibilities I couldn't imagine. These flowers. He stopped, swallowed hard. She called them her resurrection garden, said they proved that nothing beautiful ever truly dies. It just waits for the right conditions to return. Clara looked up at him, tears streaming down her face, and Jonas saw that she understood. The crocuses weren't just flowers. They were Margaret's final gift, her blessing on this new family. Her way of saying that life continuing didn't mean forgetting, that joy returning didn't mean grief had been insufficient, that loving again didn't diminish what came before. We should pick some, Ella said suddenly. Bring them inside, so we can all enjoy them together, me and Mama Clara and Papa, and the first Mama too, because these are her flowers, so she's kind of here with us. The child's logic was both simple and profound. Jonas felt Clara's questioning gaze, asking permission to touch Margaret's flowers, to claim space in traditions that predated her arrival. He nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging his throat. Clara picked 3 flowers with infinite care, one for each of them. She tucked one into Ella's hair, making the girl giggle. She kept one for herself, holding it like something precious and fragile. And she offered the third to Jonas with trembling hands. For you, she said quietly, to remember, to honor what you had, what you lost, and how you survived to find us. All of it matters, Jonas. All of it brought us to this moment. Jonas took the flower, pressed it to his lips, then tucked it into his coat pocket over his heart. The gesture felt ceremonial, significant, accepting grief and hope in equal measure, honoring the past while embracing the future. They walked back to the house in silence, but it was comfortable now, full of understanding rather than awkwardness. Inside, Clara found a small jar, filled it with water, arranged the crocuses she'd picked with care. She set them on the kitchen table where morning light would touch them, where they'd see them every day, constant reminder that beauty returned even after the hardest winters. The rest of that day passed in gentle domesticity. Clara taught Ella to make biscuits from scratch, laughing when Ella got flour in her hair and on her nose. Jonas repaired a fence line that had needed attention for months, finding the work meditative rather than burdensome. They ate dinner together as the sun set, 3 people who'd found each other through desperation and choice in equal measure, building something that felt increasingly solid. That evening, after Ella had gone to bed, Jonas and Clara sat together going through the packages that had arrived as wedding gifts. Mrs. Kowalski's contained preserved vegetables and a note in broken English, for helping through rest of winter. Is hard to start with nothing. Now you have something. Mrs. Carmichael had sent fabric enough for Clara to make a new dress, the first one that wouldn't be patched and mended. So you have something that's truly yours. The accompanying note read, something chosen, not just survived in. There were other gifts, 2 practical things like kitchen utensils, bags of flour and sugar, even a small amount of money from families who remembered what it was like to start over with nothing. The generosity made Clara cry, made her press her face against Jonas's shoulder and shake with emotion she couldn't quite name. They don't all hate me, she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. Some of them actually see me, see us, see that we're trying to build something real. More than some, Jonas corrected gently. The ones who matter. The ones who understand that life isn't about maintaining appearances or judging circumstances. It's about showing up for each other, especially when things are hard. Clara pulled back, wiped at her tears, managed a shaky smile. I want to do something for them. For the people who've been kind. I don't have much, but I could... She stopped thinking. I could start a garden in spring, grow more than we need, share the surplus with families who helped us when we had nothing. That's months away, Jonas pointed out. What about now? Clara's expression turned thoughtful. Now I could teach. Ella's not the only child who needs education. We could invite families here, the ones whose children might not otherwise get proper schooling. I could teach them what my father taught me, letters, numbers, history. Give them the same foundation he gave me. Jonas stared at his wife, seeing the teacher's daughter emerge more clearly. You'd do that. Open our home to half the territory's children deal with the chaos and noise and work. I'd love it, Clara said simply. I'd be doing what my father did, passing on knowledge to children who deserve better than ignorance. And Jonas, she took his hand, squeezed them. It would show everyone that we're not just taking, that we're contributing to this community even if we started with nothing, that we have value beyond what we own. The idea had merit. More than merit, it was brilliant. It would give Clara purpose beyond housework, would demonstrate her education and competence to anyone who still doubted, would benefit families whose children had no other options for schooling. And selfishly, it would help Ella too, giving her peers structure the social development she needed. All right, Jonas agreed. Spring term after planting, we'll set aside the spare room as a classroom. You'll be Teacher Whitlock. But Clara, he made sure she was looking at him. You don't have to prove your worth. You don't have to earn your place here anymore. You're my wife. This is your home. You belong here regardless of what you contribute. I know, Clara said softly. But Jonas, I want to contribute. Want to build something meaningful. I spent 18 months being invisible, being nothing. Now I have the chance to be someone who matters, who makes a difference. Let me take that chance. Please. How could he refuse? How could anyone refuse when asked so honestly with such clear awareness of what was being requested and why Jonas pulled Clara close? Kissed the top of her head and felt gratitude wash through him for the 1,000th time since Christmas Eve. The weeks that followed established rhythms that began to feel like real life rather than provisional arrangement. Clara settled into the household with increasing confidence, making changes that improved everything. Reorganizing the pantry so supplies lasted longer, establishing routines that made work flow more smoothly, bringing order to chaos. Jonas hadn't even recognized as chaos until she fixed it. But it was the small moments that revealed how deeply she'd woven herself into their family. The way she'd taken to reading to Ella every night, creating stories when books ran out. How she'd started leaving notes for Jonas, little messages tucked into his coat pocket or left on his pillow. Nothing elaborate, just thinking of you, or proud of the work you did today. The morning Jonas came in from chores to find her dancing with Ella in the kitchen, both of them laughing flour from baking, dusting their clothes and hair. The town's hostility didn't disappear, but it shifted. Mrs. Patterson's circle continued their disapproval, but their influence waned as other families, especially those with children who would benefit from Clara's proposed school, began defending the Whitlock family openly. When Clara attended church, she no longer stood alone. Mrs. Carmichael sat beside her. Mrs. Kowalski nodded approval from across the aisle. Young mothers whose children needed education made a point of greeting her warmly. The transformation wasn't complete or universal. There were still whispers, still judgment, still people who would never accept Clara as anything but the desperate woman who'd arrived in rags. But increasingly, those voices were drowned out by others, people who saw what Jonas saw, who recognized worth when it stood before them, regardless of how it was packaged. One Sunday in late March, as snow finally gave way to mud, and the first real hints of spring, Reverend Mackey approached Jonas and Clara after service. "I owe you both an apology," he said without preamble. "I let concern about appearances override concern for truth. I questioned whether your marriage was proper when I should have been celebrating that two wounded people found healing in each other. Clara, you've proven yourself a devoted wife and mother. Jonas, you've proven yourself a man of integrity who sees value where others see only circumstances. I was wrong to doubt. The congregation was wrong to judge. Will you forgive us?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. They always did when people showed her unexpected kindness, but she managed to smile. "There's nothing to forgive, Reverend. You married us when you could have refused. You stood up for us when you could have remained silent. That matters more than any momentary doubt." The Reverend looked relieved, squeezed both their hands, then moved on to other parishioners. But his public apology had been witnessed by dozens of people, and Jonas saw how it rippled through the crowd. If the Reverend endorsed the Whitlock marriage, if he admitted to being wrong in his initial concerns, then perhaps others could reconsider their judgments too. Walking back to the wagon, Clara leaned against Jonas's side with the comfortable familiarity of a wife rather than the tentative uncertainty of a new bride. "It's getting better," she said softly. "Slowly, but it's getting better. People are starting to see us as a family rather than a scandal." "We are a family," Jonas confirmed. "Have been since Christmas Eve, whether anyone else recognized it or not." At home, they found the crocuses had spread more blooms emerging daily, turning the small garden plot into a riot of purple and gold that could be seen from the road. Neighbors began stopping to admire them, to comment on how beautiful they were, how remarkable that they'd returned after 2 years of absence. Jonas knew what they were really saying, how remarkable that life returned to the Whitlock house, that joy had replaced grief, that the broken man and desperate woman had somehow created something beautiful together. One evening in early April, as they sat together after Ella had gone to bed, Clara showed Jonas careful plans she'd been sketching for the school. "I've been thinking about how to structure lessons," she explained, spreading papers across the kitchen table. "Different ages need different approaches, but if I'm clever about it, I can teach multiple levels simultaneously. The older children can help the younger ones, which reinforces their own learning while giving me more capacity. We'll need slates, chalk, some basic texts, but I've been corresponding with families, and several have offered to contribute supplies in exchange for their children attending." Jonas studied the plans, impressed by their thoroughness. "You've really thought this through." "I've had time," Clara said with a slight smile. "And Jonas, I've been thinking about something else too. About the ranch. About ways we might increase income so we're not always just barely surviving." She pulled out another set of papers, these covered with numbers and calculations that made Jonas's head spin. Clara had been going through the ranch's accounts, such as they were analyzing income and expenses, with the precision of someone educated in mathematics. "You're spending too much on feed," she said bluntly, "and selling cattle at the wrong times when prices are lowest. If we adjusted the timing, improved the feed efficiency, and diversified a bit, maybe adding chickens for eggs to sell in town, or starting a small dairy operation, we could increase income by at least 30%, maybe more." Jonas stared at his wife, seeing yet another dimension to her competence. "You know about ranch finances?" "My father managed the school's budget," Clara explained. "Same principles apply: maximizing resources, timing sales strategically, finding multiple revenue streams instead of depending on one. I've been watching how you work, Jonas. You're good at the physical labor, but the business side—" She softened her words with a smile. "That could use some attention. Let me help. Let me use the skills I have to make this ranch more profitable." It was the kind of partnership Jonas had wanted with Margaret, but never achieved. Having a wife who understood not just the domestic side, but the financial realities, who could contribute strategic thinking alongside physical work, it was more than he'd imagined possible. "All right," he agreed. "Show me what you're thinking. We'll make decisions together." Clara's face lit up, and they spent the next hours going through her plans, adjusting details, arguing good-naturedly about priorities. By the time they finally went to bed, Jonas felt something he hadn't experienced in years: optimism about the future. About the not naive hope that everything would be perfect, but grounded confidence that they could build something sustainable together. In bed, Clara curled against his side with the casual intimacy of familiarity, and Jonas marveled at how quickly this had become normal. Having another person in his bed, in his life, in his heart, it no longer felt like betrayal or replacement. It felt like exactly what Margaret had told him: to seek a partnership based on character and mutual respect, building something new without erasing what came before. "Jonas," Clara's voice was soft in the darkness. "Can I tell you something? Anything. I think I might be pregnant." Jonas went completely still, his breath catching. A baby. A child that would be both of theirs, tying them together in ways beyond legal contract or spoken vows. Evidence that this marriage was real, generative, creating life instead of just surviving. "How long have you known?" he asked when he could speak again. "I'm not certain yet," Claire admitted. "It's too early to be sure, but I felt different the past week, and I'm late. It could be nothing: stress adjustment, any number of things. But Jonas—" She propped herself up on one elbow to look at him in the moonlight streaming through the window. "If I'm pregnant, are you happy about it? Or is it too soon?" "Too much." Jonas pulled her back down against his chest, held her close, felt his heart hammering with emotions too complex to name individually. Joy, fear, hope, anxiety, all tangled together. "I'm happy," he said firmly. "Scared because I know what can go wrong. Worried because we're barely stable ourselves. But happy, Clara, so happy. A baby. Our baby would be." He couldn't finish, overcome by emotion. Clara kissed his jaw, his neck, his shoulder. "Then we'll hope I'm right. We'll hope that by fall there'll be 4 of us instead of 3. Another miracle like the crocuses blooming when everyone thought they were dead. They lay together in the darkness, hands intertwined over Clara's still flat stomach, both imagining the possibility of new life. Jonas thought about Ella becoming a big sister, about raising a child who would never know the grief and isolation that had marked her early years, about building a family that grew instead of diminishing. Spring arrived properly in late April, transforming the Wyoming landscape from brown to green almost overnight. Clara's garden flourished she'd planted with the careful planning she brought to everything, maximizing every inch of available space. The chickens she'd insisted they add produced eggs that sold well in town. The dairy cow she'd somehow convinced Jonas they needed turned out to be a financial boon, butter and cream, fetching good prices from families tired of making do without. And the school opened as planned, transforming the spare room into a classroom that buzzed with energy 3 days a week. 8 children attended, initially ranging from 6 to 13, all hungry for education their families couldn't otherwise provide. Clara taught with patience and creativity, making learning feel like adventure rather than drudgery. Jonas would come in from working to find his house full of children's voices reading aloud, reciting multiplication tables, arguing good-naturedly about history questions Clara posed. The chaos should have been overwhelming. Instead, it felt like the house had finally remembered its purpose to be a home full of life and noise and the messy business of growing. The town's perception shifted further as word spread about Clara's teaching. Families whose children attended spoke highly of her competence, her kindness, the obvious improvement in their children's abilities. Even some of Mrs. Patterson's circle had to grudgingly admit that perhaps the ragged woman Jonas married had value after all. By June, Clara's pregnancy was undeniable, visible in the slight swell of her belly, the glow in her cheeks, the way she moved with careful protection of the life growing inside her. Ella was ecstatic, already planning what she'd teach her new sibling, how she'd be the best big sister in Wyoming. "Do you think the first mama is happy?" Ella asked one evening as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set in streaks of orange and pink. "About the new baby?" Clara and Jonas exchanged glances, both touched by the question's innocence and insight. "I think she'd be very happy," Clara said gently, pulling Ella into her lap. "I think she wanted your papa to have a full life, wanted you to have siblings, wanted this house to be full of love. So yes, sweetheart, I think she's happy. I think she's watching from heaven and smiling." "I think so too." Ella agreed with the certainty of faith uncomplicated by doubt. "I think she sent you to us, you and the new baby, because she knew we needed you." Jonas felt his throat tighten, felt Clara's hand seek his, and let himself believe his daughter might be right. Maybe Margaret had orchestrated this somehow, sending Clara to their door on Christmas Eve, ensuring the crocuses bloomed at exactly the right moment, blessing this new family with her presence instead of her absence. Or maybe it was just life, random and chaotic, and sometimes brutal, occasionally throwing desperate people together in ways that created healing instead of harm. Either way, the result was the same, a family built from ruins growing stronger each day. In July, disaster struck, not the kind Jonas had feared, but the inevitable challenges that came with farming and ranching in unforgiving territory. A late freeze killed half of Clara's garden. 3 cows got sick with something the veterinarian couldn't identify, costing money they barely had for treatment. The dairy cow dried up unexpectedly, cutting off that income stream, and a fence collapsed in a storm, requiring days of work to repair. Jonas felt the old despair creeping back, the sense that no matter how hard they worked, Wyoming would always take more than it gave. But Clara refused to surrender to hopelessness. "We adapt," she said firmly, when Jonas suggested maybe they should sell the ranch, move somewhere easier. "We figure out what works and do more of that. What doesn't work, we stop. But we don't give up Jonas. We didn't survive everything we've survived just to quit when things get hard." So they adapted. Replanted the garden with crops that could handle the shorter season. Sold the sick cows before they could infect the others. Found a new dairy cow at auction that Clara negotiated down to a price they could afford. Fixed the fence together, Clara working beside Jonas, despite her pregnancy refusing to be coddled. And slowly, incrementally, things stabilized again. The fall harvest was modest but sufficient. The school continued bringing in small income that helped cover expenses. Clara's sewing skills, developed through years of mending her own tattered clothes, became another revenue source, as town women discovered she could alter and repair garments with professional skill. They weren't prosperous, weren't comfortable in any traditional sense, but they were surviving, and more than that, they were building something sustainable. In October, as leaves turned gold and the first hints of winter appeared on the horizon, Clara went into labor. Jonas sent Ella to stay with Mrs. Carmichael, then sent for the midwife. But the baby came fast, too fast for help to arrive. So it was just the two of them, Jonas and Clara, facing birth together with fear and determination in equal measure. Jonas had done this before, had held Margaret's hand through Ella's birth, but this felt different, more immediate, more terrifying, more real. "I can't do this," Clara gasped at one point, exhausted and scared. "Jonas, I can't." "You can." Jonas insisted, holding her hand so tightly he worried he'd break her bones. "Clara, you walked 37 miles through a blizzard. You survived 18 months that should have destroyed you. You can do this. You can do anything." And she could. She did. With strength Jonas could only watch in awe, Clara brought their son into the world, screaming and red and perfect. Everything Jonas had been terrified he'd lost forever when Margaret and his first son died. The midwife arrived 30 minutes later, checked them both, declared everything fine, and left Jonas and Clara alone with their new baby. Jonas held his son with shaking hands, seeing Margaret's ghost fade a little further as this new life demanded attention to the present rather than the past. "What should we name him?" Clara asked, her voice exhausted but triumphant. "I was thinking, if you're comfortable with it, maybe Matthew. It means gift of God, and Jonas, he feels like a gift. Like everything we survived was leading us to him." Matthew. Not a name with family history, but a name chosen for meaning, for hope, for the future they were building together. Jonas looked at his wife, sweaty, exhausted, beautiful in her strength, and nodded. "Matthew Whitlock," he said, testing how it sounded. "Our son. Our gift." They brought Matthew home from the bedroom where he'd been born into the house that was slowly becoming more theirs than a shrine to the past. Ella came home the next day and was immediately smitten, holding her baby brother with the exaggerated care of an older sibling taking responsibility seriously. "I'll teach him everything," she announced solemnly. "How to read and count and be good. And when he's older, I'll tell him about both mamas, the one who went to heaven and the one who came in the snow, so he knows the whole story." Clara's eyes filled with tears. They still did easily, but now they were more often tears of joy than pain. "That's exactly right, sweetheart. Both mamas are part of our family. Both always will be." Winter came again, but this time the house didn't feel empty or cold. It felt full crowded, sometimes loud, often messy, always, but so completely alive that Jonas barely recognized it as the same place where he'd wallowed in grief for 2 years. One evening in December, nearly a year since Clara had collapsed on their doorstep, Jonas stood outside looking at the house. Lamplight glowed golden in the windows. Inside he could see Clara moving around the kitchen, Matthew in a sling against her chest. Could hear Ella's laughter high and bright as she played some game. Could smell bread, baking coffee, brewing all the domestic scents that signified home. The crocuses that had bloomed in spring had multiplied, Clara carefully dividing them and planting more. Come spring, the whole garden would be purple and gold, Margaret's legacy spreading, blessing the new family Jonas had been terrified to build. He thought about the letter Margaret had written about her instruction to choose character over circumstance, to let worth be measured by integrity rather than appearance. She'd known. Somehow she'd known exactly what he would need to hear when the time came. Clara appeared in the doorway, Matthew cradled against her shoulder. "Jonas, are you coming in? It's freezing out here." "Just thinking," Jonas said, crossing to join his wife, "about how much has changed, how different everything is from a year ago." Clara looked up at him. This woman who'd arrived in rags but proven herself richer in character than anyone Jonas had ever known. "Are you sorry for any of it? For choosing me instead of staying safe in your grief?" "Not for a single moment," Jonas said honestly, wrapping his arm around her shoulders, pulling his family close. terrified sometimes, overwhelmed often. But sorry, never Clara, never. They stood together in the doorway watching snow begin to fall, the first real snow of the season covering the world in white. Inside, Ella called for them to come see the picture she'd drawn. Matthew stirred, making the small sounds that meant he'd wake soon and need feeding. The fire needed tending. Dishes needed washing. Life needed living in all its mundane, beautiful, complicated detail. But before they went inside, Jonas pressed a kiss to Clara's forehead, breathed in the scent of her, felt Matthew's small warmth between them, and let himself feel gratitude, raw, overwhelming, humbling gratitude for the choice he'd made on Christmas Eve. Not to turn away the woman in rags, but to open the door to see past circumstances, to character, to give her the chance to prove what she was made of. That choice had changed everything, had transformed his house back into a home, had given Ella a mother who chose to love her, had given him a wife who understood that life was hard but worth fighting for anyway, had given all of them a future built on honest partnership rather than naive fantasy. "Come on," Clara said, tugging him toward the warmth inside. "Our family's waiting." Our family, not his family that Clara had joined, not a patchwork of grief and desperation held together by legal contract, but our family built together, chosen together, creating something new while honoring what came before. Jonas followed his wife inside, closed the door against the cold, and let himself believe what a year ago he'd thought impossible, that happiness real and lasting and earned through struggle was possible even after the worst losses. That worth really was measured by character, not circumstance. That love could happen twice in one lifetime, each iteration precious in its own way, neither diminishing the other. And that sometimes, just sometimes, desperate choices made in the dead of winter could bloom into something beautiful when spring finally came. The crocuses would prove that next March, rising purple and gold through the last of the snow covering the ground where Margaret had planted them, with a blessing for whoever came next. For Clara, who'd walked 37 miles through a blizzard to reach a door she prayed wouldn't close against her. For Jonas, who'd found the courage to open that door instead of barricading himself behind grief. For Ella, who'd prayed for a mama and received one who chose to love her every single day. For Matthew, who would grow up knowing both mothers, the one who'd gone to heaven and the one who'd come through the snow as part of his family's story. For all of them building a life together in an unforgiving place, proving that survival wasn't enough. You had to choose to truly live, to risk love again, to believe that worth existed even when circumstances tried to hide it. Jonas closed the door, turned to face his family, gathered in their warm kitchen, and finally let himself rest in the knowledge that he was home. Not because the place had changed, but because he'd chosen to fill it with people worth coming home to, worth building a life with, worth surviving every hardship for. Clara had arrived in rags on Christmas Eve. Jonas had seen her worth and chosen her. And in that choice, that single terrifying necessary choice, they'd all found salvation. Not from circumstances which would always be hard, but from the loneliness and despair that had threatened to consume them before they found each other in the snow and decided together to survive into something better than either had imagined possible. The end.